Welcome to Dark History, the channel where the shadows of the past come alive. Here, we uncover the secrets, mysteries, and untold stories that shaped our world. Stories of kings and queens, battles and betrayals, heroes and villains. Every tale is steeped in suspense. Every chapter pulls back the veil on history you thought you knew. Today, we journey into a world of ambition, power, and intrigue, where one king's rise and fall changed the course of England forever. If you love stories that blend mystery, history, and the darkness between the lines, make sure to subscribe to Dark History and hit the bell icon so you never miss a tale from the shadows. Now, let's step back into the past and witness history as you've never seen it before. Chapter 1. England in Turmoil. The year is 1455. England is a fractured kingdom, torn apart not by foreign invaders, but by its own ruling families. A nation that should have been basking in the triumphs of medieval might is instead spiraling into blood-soaked chaos. The Wars of the Roses, a dynastic struggle between two rival houses, Lancaster and York, casts a long and deadly shadow over the land. The throne of England, once a symbol of stability and divine right, has become a seat of suspicion, ambition, and betrayal. At the heart of this storm lies a boy, Richard of York, who would grow up in a world where survival demanded not just courage, but cunning, ruthlessness, and the ability to strike before being struck. England at this time is restless. The feudal order that once kept the peace is crumbling. Noble families clash, not only on the battlefield but also in the courts, churches, and marketplaces. Villages burn, castles fall, and loyalty is bought and sold like coin. To the common people, kingship is no longer sacred. It is fragile, unstable, and bloody. The Wars of the Roses were more than battles for crowns and titles. They were wars for survival. The House of Lancaster, represented by the Red Rose, claimed legitimacy through direct descent from Edward III. The House of York, symbolized by the White Rose, argued their claim was stronger. Each side declared its cause as just, yet both cloaked their ambition in blood. Into this world of shifting alliances, whispers of betrayal, and ceaseless war, Richard entered history. Born in 1452 at Fothering Castle, Richard was the youngest son of Richard, Duke of York, and Cecily Neville. His birth was overshadowed by turmoil. His father was one of the most powerful nobles in England, yet also one of the most hated by the Lancastrian king, Henry VI. Henry VI was not the kind of monarch England needed. Pious, gentle, and often incapacitated by bouts of mental instability, he was a king more suited to prayer than to rule. His weakness left England vulnerable, not only to foreign threats like France and Scotland, but also to the ambitions of men who saw the crown as theirs for the taking. Among them stood Richard's father. For young Richard, childhood was no sanctuary. The sounds of clashing steel and burning towns were his lullabies. His early years were marked not by games in royal courts, but by the constant fear that his family's enemies might one day rise against him. He was the son of a man branded both a traitor and a rightful king, depending on who told the story. The Wars of the Roses were not fought with honor alone. They were fought with daggers in the dark, betrayals whispered in corridors, and alliances sealed with marriages and broken with murders. Even as a child, Richard would have understood that in this England, no man could be trusted completely, not even kin. The stage was set for a lifetime of suspicion. To grow up Yorkist, in an England ruled by Lancastrians, was to live with a target painted on your back. Every feast could turn into a trap. Every ally could become an enemy. Every smile could conceal a dagger. This was the England that shaped Richard. A land where the crown was both prize and curse. A land where bloodlines determined life or death. A land where the shadow of civil war never faded, but grew darker with each passing year. And as Richard grew, so too did the storm that would engulf his family. His father's ambition would soon lead to open rebellion. the House of York was preparing to challenge the Lancastrian throne directly. For Richard, this was not just history, it was survival, and it was only the beginning, because the boy born into chaos would one day wear the crown himself. And when he did, the kingdom would tremble under the weight of both fear and legend. But before Richard became king, he was simply a child watching his world collapse, a boy standing in the shadows of giants, who would one day cast a shadow of his own. And so, our story begins. Chapter 2. The House of York. The House of York was no ordinary noble family. It was a dynasty caught between legitimacy and rebellion, a family whose blood carried both the promise of kingship and the curse of ambition. To understand Richard III, we must first step into the heart of his family, the people who molded him, betrayed him, and whose legacies he would one day inherit. Richard's father, Richard, Duke of York, was not merely a noble with vague aspirations. He was a man with a claim to the throne of England that rivaled, and in some eyes, surpassed that of the reigning king, Henry VI of Lancaster. Through his descent from Edmund of Langley, the fourth son of King Edward III, the Duke of York carried royal blood that burned with entitlement. To his supporters, he was the rightful king. To his enemies, he was a dangerous pretender who threatened to plunge England into ruin. His mother, Cecily Neville, known as the Rose of Raby, was equally formidable. A woman of sharp mind and unshakable pride, Cecily raised her children with a deep sense of destiny. She believed her sons were meant for greatness, and she instilled in them the conviction that the Yorkist cause was not merely political, it was divine. Richard, the youngest, would absorb her lessons in silence, learning early that survival in this family meant loyalty, vigilance, and readiness to act when fate demanded. But destiny came at a cost. Richard's early years were not lived in security, but in exile and constant danger. The Duke of York's rivalry with Queen Margaret of Anjou, Henry VI's fierce and ambitious queen, escalated into open conflict. Margaret was not a woman to be underestimated. Intelligent, ruthless, and determined to secure the crown for her son, Prince Edward of Lancaster, she became York's greatest adversary. For young Richard, she was the embodiment of Lancastrian wrath, a queen who would stop at nothing to annihilate his family. The Yorkist children grew up not in glittering courts, but in strongholds bracing for siege. They learned quickly that their family name was both shield and target. Richard's elder brothers, Edward, George, and Edmund, were groomed for command, while Richard, the youngest, watched and learned. He studied their victories, their mistakes, and the terrible reality that loyalty meant little in a kingdom where betrayal was currency. The Wars of the Roses soon exploded into full force. Castles were stormed, noblemen executed, and entire families wiped out in a single night. In 1460, at the Battle of Wakefield, Richard's father, the Duke of York, was slain. His head was displayed on the gates of York, with a paper crown mockingly placed upon it. Alongside him fell Richard's elder brother Edmund. Richard was only 8 years old, and yet he was already learning one of the darkest lessons of medieval power. Kingship was not a crown of honor, but of thorns. The murder of his father and brother was not just a loss, it was a message. The Lancastrians were telling the Yorkist children, "You will never rule in peace." But fate had other plans. Within months, Richard's elder brother Edward seized the crown. In 1461, he defeated the Lancastrians at the Battle of Towton, one of the bloodiest battles ever fought on English soil. Over 28,000 men lay dead by nightfall, the fields drenched in crimson. From the ashes of war, Edward of York became Edward IV, King of England. For Richard, this moment was transformative. He was no longer the child of a fallen rebel. He was the brother of a king. The House of York had ascended, and Richard had entered a world where power was not inherited passively. It was taken, seized with blood and iron. Yet this rise was not secure. Edward IV's reign brought prosperity, but also enemies. Old wounds did not heal overnight, and the Lancastrians remained a threat. Queen Margaret continued to plot, her son Edward, growing into a young man, eager to reclaim what his family had lost. And in the shadows, noble houses shifted loyalties. Some swearing allegiance to Edward, others waiting for the chance to betray him. Richard, now a teenager, found himself in the center of this turbulent world. Unlike his towering brother Edward, Richard was slight of build, with a crooked back that would later become infamous. But what he lacked in physical presence, he made up for in determination, discipline, and intelligence. Trained in arms, politics, and the ruthless arts of survival, he became a soldier and statesman in miniature, molded by the crucible of his family's struggles. The House of York was victorious, but it was also divided. Within its own halls, tensions festered. Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, a commoner widow, infuriated many nobles, especially Richard's cousin, the powerful Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker. To some, Edward had betrayed the Yorkist cause by marrying for love instead of alliance. To others, it was a fatal misstep that would weaken the dynasty. Richard, still young, observed all of this. He learned that power was not secured merely by winning battles. It required careful balancing of loyalties, silencing of dissent, and the ability to anticipate betrayal before it struck. The boy who had grown up in exile and war was now becoming a man who understood that shadows were often deadlier than swords. The House of York had claimed the throne, but England remained restless. Every feast carried whispers of conspiracy. Every battle left scars, and every victory seemed to come with a price. Richard's story was no longer that of a child surviving in chaos. He was now a prince in a kingdom where his family's crown gleamed brightly, but cast a shadow long and dangerous, enough to swallow them all. Chapter 3. The Shadows of the Court. The court of Edward IV shimmered with splendor, but beneath its glittering surface, danger brewed. For young Richard, this was no playground of nobility. It was a battlefield dressed in silks and jewels. Here, daggers were hidden behind smiles, and treachery was poured into wine cups with the same ease as laughter. Edward IV was everything Richard was not: tall, broad, handsome, and charismatic. He was a warrior king who inspired loyalty with his charm and won battles with his towering frame. But Edward's greatest strength was also his greatest weakness. His appetites for power, for pleasure, and for women often clouded his judgment, and in those lapses, shadows crept in. Richard stood in the background, watching, listening, absorbing. Though younger and less commanding, he cultivated a different kind of strength. He was meticulous, cautious, and deliberate. Where Edward relied on charisma, Richard relied on calculation. He studied not only the king's allies, but also his enemies, storing away knowledge like a weapon to be drawn at the right moment. The greatest of those enemies was the Earl of Warwick, once Edward's most loyal supporter, now his bitter foe. Warwick had been instrumental in placing Edward on the throne, earning him the fearsome title of the Kingmaker. But Edward's unexpected marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had shattered their alliance. Elizabeth brought with her a family, the Woodvilles, who rose rapidly in power, pushing aside Warwick's influence. To Warwick, it was an unforgivable insult, a betrayal of the Yorkist cause he had shed blood to defend. Richard watched as factions tore at each other like wolves. Warwick, once a pillar of the Yorkist dynasty, now plotted rebellion. The Woodvilles, ambitious and calculating, consolidated power with ruthless efficiency. And in the middle was Edward, trying to balance passion with politics, often failing in both. But Richard was not idle. He was sent north, to the harsh, battle-scarred lands of Yorkshire, to govern in the king's name. It was there, among the restless barons and bitter remnants of Lancastrian resistance, that Richard found his place. He was not simply a boy of the court anymore. He was becoming a commander, a man trusted to bring order where chaos lingered. In the north, Richard proved his worth. Unlike many nobles, he treated the people with fairness, earning their respect. He pursued justice with rigor, determined to show that Yorkist rule was not just another tyranny, and in the process, he began building something that would later prove invaluable: loyalty. The North remembered him not as a distant prince, but as a protector, a ruler who stood among them rather than above them. But while Richard gained strength in the North, the South descended into chaos. Warwick, furious with Edward, did the unthinkable. He allied himself with Margaret of Anjou, the very Lancastrian queen he had once fought to destroy. Together, they plotted Edward's downfall, and for a time, they succeeded. Edward was captured, humiliated, stripped of his crown. The Yorkist dynasty teetered on the brink of collapse. Richard, still young, remained fiercely loyal. He stood by his brother, even when Edward's fortunes crumbled. In those desperate days, Richard learned a truth that would define him. Power is fragile. Crowns can be lost in a single night, and loyalty must be chosen carefully, for once given, it can destroy or save you. Though Edward regained his throne, the scars of betrayal never faded. The rebellion had shown that even the mightiest allies could turn traitor, and even the most powerful kings could be toppled. Richard understood this better than anyone, and from that moment on, he would never underestimate the hunger of ambition or the danger of misplaced trust. The court glittered still, but Richard had seen behind its veil. He knew the smiles were masks, the oaths temporary, the loyalty conditional. In the shadows of the court, Richard began to craft his own identity. Not the laughing prince, not the charming king, but the watcher in the dark, the man who studied every move, weighed every word, and waited for the moment to strike. Chapter 4: Baptism by Fire. The year was 1471, and England was aflame once again. The War of the Roses, that bitter struggle between York and Lancaster, roared back to life. And this time, young Richard would not be watching from the shadows. He would be in the thick of it, baptized by fire, blood, and steel. Edward IV, restored to power after his temporary fall, now faced his greatest challenge. Margaret of Anjou had returned from exile, rallying the Lancastrian cause. Warwick, the kingmaker, had thrown in his lot with her, turning the very architect of Yorkist victory into their deadliest enemy. The stage was set for a brutal reckoning, and Richard, barely 18 years old, stood ready to prove himself. The clash came first at Barnet, a battle shrouded in mist and confusion. Dawn broke on Easter Sunday. Yet the field was swallowed in a fog so thick that men could scarcely see more than a few paces ahead. To Richard, it must have seemed like marching into the jaws of an unseen beast. The cries of soldiers, the clash of steel, the screams of the dying, all of it muffled by the fog, turning the battlefield into a nightmare. DREAMSCAPE. Here. Richard fought not as a prince shielded from danger but as a commander of men. He led his forces with ferocity, charging into the melee, his small frame belying the fire within. Chroniclers would later write that Richard fought with a courage and skill far beyond his years, rallying the Yorkist troops when others faltered. In the chaos, Warwick himself fell. The kingmaker, the man who had built Edward's throne and then tried to tear it down, was cut down on the field. His body was dragged, bloodied, and broken, to St. Paul's Cathedral, where it was displayed as proof that the great warlord was no more. For Richard, it was a brutal lesson. Even giants could fall, and in England, no man was untouchable. But Barnet was only the beginning. Soon after came the Battle of Tewkesbury, a confrontation that would etch itself into Richard's very soul. The Lancastrians, desperate and defiant, rallied under the banner of young Edward of Westminster, the Prince of Wales, the last true hope of their line. The clash was savage, merciless. Richard fought alongside Edward IV, and once again, his courage was unmistakable. He drove his men into the fray with unrelenting fury, carving a path through the Lancastrian lines. The fighting raged through fields and hedgerows, the ground slick with blood. By the day's end, the Lancastrian cause lay in ruins. Prince Edward of Westminster was slain, cut down in the rout. Accounts differ. Some say he fell in battle, others that he was executed after capture. But one thing was certain, with his death, the Lancastrian dream of restoration died too. Margaret of Anjou was taken prisoner, her will broken, her dynasty shattered. Richard had seen victory, yes, but he had also seen what it cost. The War of the Roses was not chivalry. It was not noble banners fluttering in the wind. It was a butcher's field, where the young, the proud, and the ambitious were torn apart in the mud. He had fought bravely, but he had also learned that power was bought not just with loyalty or cunning, it was paid for in blood. In the aftermath, Richard's reputation soared. Chroniclers noted his valor, his leadership, his loyalty to Edward. The people of the North, already inclined to trust him, now saw in him not just a governor, but a warrior. He was becoming more than Edward's younger brother. He was becoming indispensable. And yet, in the silence after the battles, Richard must have felt something stirred deep within him. He had faced death and survived. He had seen a prince, heir to the Lancastrian line, struck down like any other man. He had felt the weight of power, the intoxicating knowledge that destiny could shift in a single blade stroke. It was a lesson he would never forget. In the furnace of war, Richard had been tested, and in the blood-soaked fields of Barnet and Tewkesbury, he was forged into something new. No longer the quiet, watchful boy. Now, he was a man hardened by battle, sharpened by loyalty, and tempered by the cruel truth of war. But victory carried with it another shadow. For while the Yorkists stood triumphant, the question lingered: how long could triumph last in a kingdom where betrayal was the coin of the realm, and power was never safe, not even in a king's hand? Chapter 5. Lord of the North. The smoke of Barnet and Tewkesbury still hung over England when Richard Plantagenet returned north. He came not as the quiet boy once sent to Middleham to learn the ways of knighthood, nor even as the prince tested in battle. He returned as something more, the trusted brother of the king, the hammer of the Lancastrians, and soon the lord of a vast dominion, Edward IV. Grateful for Richard's loyalty and courage, rewarded him handsomely. Lands, titles, offices, they poured into his hands, but above all, Edward granted him the North, that restless, half-tamed expanse where Yorkist power was most fragile. It was no gift of leisure. It was a throne of knives. The North was a land of border skirmishes, feuding nobles, and simmering Lancastrian loyalties. If the House of York was to endure, it needed a strong hand to rule there, and Edward trusted no one more than his brother Richard. From the great city of York to the wind-swept dales of Yorkshire, Richard became the king's eyes, ears, and sword. He established himself at Middleham Castle, the place where he had once trained as a boy under Warwick's guardianship. Now, he returned as lord and master, commanding retainers, doling out justice, and shaping the lives of thousands. It was here that Richard began to reveal a different side of himself. He was no longer just a warrior. He became an administrator, a governor, even a judge. To the surprise of many, Richard ruled with fairness. Petitioners from towns and villages found him attentive and often merciful. He cut through disputes with a decisiveness that won him admiration. In a realm torn by civil war, his governance brought something rare: stability. Yet, his rule was not without steel. The North was a breeding ground for rebellion, and Richard had no tolerance for treachery. When Lancastrian sympathizers stirred, he crushed them swiftly. When border raiders tested his strength, he struck back harder. His reputation grew, not just as Edward's loyal brother, but as a prince who commanded respect in his own right. The bond between Richard and the people of the north deepened, while Edward preferred the pleasures of London and the grandeur of the southern court. Richard embedded himself among the northerners. He listened to their grievances, walked among them, and, in time, earned their loyalty. To many in the north, he became almost a king in all but name. They called him the good lord of the north. But beneath this veneer of justice and loyalty, darker seeds were being sown. For Richard, every act of governance, every sword raised in battle, carried with it a single, undeniable truth: power could not be shared. He had seen it with Warwick, the kingmaker. He had seen it with the Lancastrians. Ambition destroyed those who divided their strength, so Richard built his power carefully, piece by piece, ensuring that his authority in the north was absolute. His marriage to a Neville, daughter of Warwick, further cemented his influence, though the union was tinged with scandal, for Anne had once been betrothed to a Lancastrian prince. It ultimately brought Richard vast estates and a stronger grip on the north. The boy who had trained under Warwick now ruled with Warwick's legacy in his hands. Yet, Richard's rise also deepened his shadow. Whispers followed him, whispers of ruthlessness, of ambition sharpened by hardship. To some, he was the loyal brother, the good lord, the warrior prince. To others, he was a man biding his time, gathering strength, waiting for the right moment to seize what fate might offer. And fate, as England would soon discover, was never gentle. The peace Edward had restored was fragile, built on uneasy alliances and the king's personal charisma. But Edward's own appetites, his love of excess, his reliance on favorites, his neglect of duty, gnawed at the stability he had fought to restore. The seeds of future conflict were already sprouting in the cracks of his court. Richard, ever watchful, saw it all. He saw how Edward indulged himself, while enemies plotted in whispers. He saw how power, once won by blood, could be squandered in luxury. And perhaps, in the cold chambers of Middleham, he began to wonder, what would happen when Edward fell? Who would hold the crown steady when the kingdom trembled once again? The North had taught Richard how to rule. The wars had taught him how to fight. But the greatest test was still to come. A test not of swords on muddy fields, but of intrigue, betrayal, and ambition in the heart of power. Chapter 6. The Fall of a King. The year was 1483. For over 2 decades, Edward IV had ruled as the mightiest of Yorkist kings, bold in battle, indulgent in peace. But power wears on even the strongest shoulders. The once vigorous warrior, whose very presence had rallied armies, was now a man swollen with excess, weighed down by years of pleasure and indulgence. The court still glimmered with gold and laughter, but behind the silks and banquets, unease spread like a shadow. Edward's health faltered. The king who had once ridden into war with thunder in his stride, now struggled to rise from his bed. Whispers spread through the palace corridors, through the markets of London, and into the darkened taverns. The king is dying. For Richard, the news must have struck like a thunderclap. His brother was not just king, he was the foundation of Richard's loyalty, the shield that protected the House of York. Without Edward, the kingdom would pass to his heir, a boy of just 12 years, Edward, Prince of Wales. The prospect chilled the court. A child king, in a realm still scarred by civil war, was a dangerous invitation to chaos. Ambitious lords, discontented nobles, and hidden Lancastrian loyalists would all see opportunity in a crown balanced upon a boy's brow. The Wars of the Roses had not ended in blood, they had only paused, waiting for weakness to show. In his final days, Edward IV tried to set his house in order. He reconciled enemies, made peace with old foes, and entrusted his son's future to the care of his most trusted allies. Chief among them was his brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Edward knew Richard's loyalty. He had proven it on battlefields, in governance, and in years of service. Richard would be the protector. the steady hand guiding the young prince until he came of age. But not everyone shared Edward's vision. The Queen, Elizabeth Woodville, had her own designs. Fiercely protective of her children, she wanted power in her family's hands, not in those of Richard. The Woodvilles, her ambitious relatives, had long been despised by the old nobility. To them, they were upstarts who had risen too high, too fast, clinging to the Queen's skirts for favor. With Edward gone, they sought to tighten their grip, to rule through the boy king, shutting Richard out of power. And so, as Edward IV lay dying in the spring of 1483, two visions of England collided. On one side stood Richard, the good lord of the north, loyal brother and seasoned commander. On the other, the Queen and her family, eager to protect their bloodline and secure the throne for themselves. The battle lines were drawn not with swords but with whispers, alliances, and secret plans. Edward's death sent shockwaves through the realm. The great king who had restored Yorkist power was gone, and in his place stood a boy. The streets of London filled with grief. But beneath the mourning hung something colder, fear. For Richard, the moment was decisive. He knew what history had shown. A weak king, surrounded by greedy courtiers, would plunge England back into chaos. He had seen it with Henry VI. He would not let it happen again, so Richard moved swiftly. He left the north with a loyal band of retainers and rode south to meet the prince, who was on his way to London for his coronation. The Queen's relatives, wary of Richard's influence, had already taken charge of the boy. They intended to bring him to the capital, crown him quickly, and rule in his name. But Richard intercepted them. With the authority of protector and the loyalty of powerful nobles, he took custody of the young Edward. To many, it seemed an act of loyalty. Richard, the faithful uncle, was stepping in to ensure the boy's safety. Yet beneath the surface, suspicion began to stir. Was this protection, or the first move in something far more dangerous? The young prince was brought to London, not as a free king, but under Richard's watchful guard. The Queen, sensing her family's downfall, fled into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey with her younger son, Richard of Shrewsbury. England held its breath. The protector now held the heir to the throne, and with him, the fate of the realm. In the north, Richard had ruled with justice. In London, his shadow deepened. For this was not the loyal brother serving a mighty king. This was a man standing at the edge of destiny, caught between oath and ambition. And as London prepared for the coronation of a boy, no one could see that the stage was being set for one of the most haunting mysteries in all of English history, the story of the Princes in the Tower. Chapter 7. The Princes in the Tower, London. Summer of 1483. The bells of the city tolled as preparations began for the coronation of Edward V, the boy king, only 12 years old, was lodged in the Tower of London, the traditional residence for monarchs before their crowning. To the people, this was custom. To Richard, Duke of Gloucester, protector of the realm, it was necessity. The boy was safe within stone walls, away from the Woodvilles, away from plots, and, perhaps, away from his mother's influence. But history would remember it differently. The Tower, a symbol of royal strength, became instead a prison. Edward was not alone. His younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, had been persuaded or forced to join him. Two sons of Edward IV, rightful heirs of York, now under the careful watch of their uncle. At first, it seemed an act of prudence. Richard declared he wanted the boys protected, their safety ensured until the coronation. Yet the coronation itself was postponed, delayed again and again. Whispers spread like wildfire. Why was the protector holding back the crowning of the king? In the echoing halls of Westminster, rumors turned to accusations. Richard's enemies claimed he was grasping for the crown, that he meant to keep the throne for himself. Supporters argued he was shielding the kingdom from Woodville corruption, buying time to cleanse the court of dangerous influence. But as days stretched into weeks, Even Richard's staunchest allies began to wonder. Then came the revelation that shook England to its core. Clerics and nobles declared that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid, that the king had already been pre-contracted to another woman. By law, this made all of Edward's children illegitimate. Suddenly, the boy in the tower was no longer a rightful king. It was a masterstroke, whether born of truth or manipulation. The claim destroyed the young Edward's legitimacy, stripping him of his crown before it could ever be placed upon his head. Parliament confirmed it. The crown, by blood and by law, now fell to Richard. And so, on a summer's day in 1483, Richard of Gloucester became Richard III, King of England. But the princes remained in the tower. At first, they were seen playing in the gardens, walking the walls, glimpsed through barred windows by curious eyes. Yet, as Richard's reign solidified, the boys were seen less and less. Guards were changed. Access was restricted. Whispers turned into dread. And then, silence. The princes vanished. What happened to them remains one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. Some say Richard, determined to secure his throne, ordered their deaths in secret, smothered in their sleep or buried in the stone foundations of the tower. Others believe they lived, spirited away in disguise, their fates hidden to protect them from political enemies. Centuries later, 2 small skeletons were discovered beneath the tower's walls, fueling speculation, but never confirming the truth. For Richard, the shadow of their disappearance became a curse. No matter what deeds he performed as king, no matter what justice he upheld, the stain of the vanished princes darkened his reign. To the people, he was no longer the loyal brother or the just protector. He was the usurper, the murderer, the man who seized the throne and destroyed his nephews to keep it. London whispered. Europe watched. And Richard, now king, ruled a realm that feared him even as it obeyed. The story of the princes in the tower is a riddle without answer. Were they murdered? Were they hidden? Or were they simply pawns crushed beneath the relentless Game of Thrones? Only the stones of the tower know the truth. Chapter 8. A Shadow Rising. Henry Tudor. While Richard III tightened his grip on England, another figure stirred across the sea. A shadow of destiny that would soon grow into a rival strong enough to shake the foundations of his reign. That figure was Henry Tudor. Henry was no warrior king, no hardened prince raised in command of armies. He was the son of Edmund Tudor and Margaret Beaufort. His claim to the throne, a tenuous thread woven through the Beaufort line, a line once declared illegitimate. By blood, his right was weaker than Richard's. By power, he had almost nothing. Yet Henry had something that mattered more than both. He had survival, and he had the loyalty of exiles, who believed he could be their weapon against Yorkist dominance. Exiled for much of his youth in Brittany, Henry grew up not in the halls of English castles, but under the wary watch of foreign rulers. He learned patience, silence, and the art of waiting in the shadows, where Richard was forged in the brutal politics of York and Lancaster. Henry was shaped by exile, a ghostly presence, spoken of in whispers, but rarely seen. And yet, after the disappearance of the princes, Henry's shadow lengthened. For every Englishman who suspected Richard of foul play, Henry became the alternative. If Richard was the tyrant who stole his nephew's crown, Henry could be the savior who restored justice. The prince's disappearance gave Henry something his weak bloodline alone could not: legitimacy born of outrage. Margaret Beaufort, Henry's mother, worked tirelessly from within England. Her web of conspiracies stretched into noble households, whispering promises of a new dawn. She reached out to discontented lords, to those disillusioned by Richard's rule, and above all, to Elizabeth Woodville, mother of the vanished princes. Their pact was daring. If Henry claimed the throne, he would marry Elizabeth of York, eldest daughter of Edward IV. This union would merge Lancaster and York, ending decades of bloody civil war. The dream of peace and vengeance hung on Henry's shoulders. Richard, of course, knew of the brewing storm. His spies carried him news of whispers, plots, and movements across the Channel. He prepared with ruthless efficiency, fortifying his realm, rewarding loyalists, and tightening his grasp on power. He even paraded his only son, Edward of Middleham, as heir to assure the kingdom of stability. But fate was cruel. In 1484, the young prince died. Richard's legacy, his line, was shattered. With no clear heir, his throne became more fragile than ever. For the discontented, for the rebels, for Margaret Beaufort and her son, this was blood in the water. Henry Tudor's name grew louder, spoken in the taverns of London, muttered in the shires, and carried across England's windswept coasts. Exile no longer seemed like a weakness. It became a mark of destiny, a figure preserved for a purpose. By 1485, Henry was ready. He gathered a small army of loyalists, mercenaries, and exiled Englishmen. His fleet set sail for Wales, where he hoped to rally more support, though Richard had the larger, stronger, and better armed force. Henry carried something Richard had lost, the illusion of righteousness. As Henry marched inland, banners raised, voices shouting for Lancaster and York united, Richard prepared for the confrontation that would define his reign. The battlefield was chosen, Bosworth Field. Chapter 9, Protector of the Realm, or Usurper. The death of Edward IV in April 1483 plunged England into uncertainty. The king's sudden passing left a child heir, Edward V, barely 12 years old, vulnerable to ambition, manipulation, and betrayal. At the heart of this turmoil stood his uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, a man both feared and admired, whose cunning, intelligence, and ruthlessness had been carefully honed over years of civil war. Richard's appointment as Lord Protector of the realm placed him in a position of immense authority, yet it also raised questions that would haunt England for decades. Would he faithfully serve his nephew, or would he seize the crown for himself? Richard's reputation preceding him was complex. To allies, he was loyal, capable, and precise, a man who upheld the code of duty to his family and his king. To his enemies, he was calculating, ambitious, and ruthless, capable of acts that would chill the spine. These dualities defined him. A life forged in the fires of the Wars of the Roses had taught him that power was both fragile and fleeting, that loyalty was often a mask for treachery, and that hesitation could prove fatal. Richard understood the dangers that surrounded the throne. He knew the ambitions of nobles, the murmurings of court factions, and the precariousness of a kingdom led by a child. The nation itself was a powder keg. Years of internecine warfare had left England fractured. The House of York, though triumphant under Edward IV, had been built on blood and conquest. The death of a king, especially one with a minor heir, reignited long-standing rivalries and resentments. Nobles who had pledged allegiance to Edward IV now measured the value of loyalty against the weight of opportunity. Rumors traveled faster than messengers. Every council meeting, every whisper in the corridors of Westminster, carried the potential to tip the balance of power. The throne was a prize, but also a trap. Richard moved with calculated precision. Within days of Edward IV's death, he secured his base of power in the north and ensured that key fortresses and loyal officials were aligned with him. Ostensibly, his goal was to protect his young nephew, to ensure the continuity of the Yorkist line and the stability of the realm. He assumed control of the royal household and the Tower of London, positioning himself as guardian over the prince. Yet the measures he implemented, though legally justified, also served to concentrate power in his hands. Every decision was scrutinized, every move debated, and every act could be interpreted as either dutiful or self-serving. Central to the question of Richard's intentions was the matter of Edward V's legitimacy. Rumors surfaced that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville might have been invalid, Allegedly. Due to a prior contract Edward had entered into with another woman. This revelation, propagated by select clergy and advisors, some aligned with Richard, cast doubt on the young king's right to inherit the throne. Whether this claim was a legal necessity or a deliberate political maneuver remains debated to this day. What is certain is that it provided Richard with a justification, at least in the eyes of some, to intervene in the succession. England now faced the terrifying possibility that a child king might be displaced, not by invasion, but by the very man charged with his protection. The atmosphere at court was tense, almost suffocating. Courtiers and nobles whispered behind closed doors, weighing allegiances and calculating risks. The city of London, normally bustling with commerce and ceremony, seemed to hold its breath. Messengers carried conflicting reports. The common people, hearing fragments of rumors, feared instability, while the clergy debated the moral and spiritual implications of succession disputes. Within this climate of uncertainty, the shadow of Richard's ambition loomed large. Richard himself was not overtly aggressive. He portrayed a calm, measured demeanor, emphasizing his legal authority and the necessity of protecting the young king. He convened councils, issued orders, and maintained a visible presence in the centers of power. Yet beneath this composed exterior lay a mind constantly calculating, assessing, and planning. Richard understood the psychology of power. He knew that appearances could be as important as action. Every gesture, every word, every decree was carefully designed to project loyalty while consolidating influence. Meanwhile, Edward V and his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, remained in the Tower of London, ostensibly for safety. The Tower, traditionally a secure royal residence in place of protection, became a symbol of both guardianship and confinement. Some historians argue that Richard's insistence on their residence there was purely protective. Others suggest it was a strategic step in his eventual claim to the throne. The ambiguity surrounding their situation fueled speculation, fear, and rumor, creating a climate in which truth and deception were nearly indistinguishable. The first months of Richard's protectorate were marked by careful maneuvering. Key Yorkist nobles were either placated or neutralized. Alliances were tested, and messages were sent to foreign courts to assert Richard's control. He demonstrated his knowledge of law, the loyalty of his military commanders, and his ability to act decisively. Every action reinforced his image as both a competent protector and a formidable political operator. Yet the shadow of doubt never left the court. England, still scarred by decades of civil war, watched and waited, sensing that the line between protection and usurpation was perilously thin. One of the most striking aspects of this period was Richard's treatment of the clergy and legal authorities. The validation of Edward IV's marriage, the declaration of Edward V's illegitimacy, and the subsequent claims to the throne required the careful orchestration of church and state. Richard leveraged his knowledge of canon law, his connections with sympathetic clerics, and the inertia of court politics to create an appearance of legitimacy. To supporters, he was upholding the law. To detractors, he was manipulating it. The ambiguity served him well, giving him plausible deniability while preparing the ground for eventual kingship. Public perception was equally complex. Londoners and the populace of England received information filtered through rumor, political pamphlets, and hearsay. Some saw Richard as a stabilizing force, a bulwark against civil unrest. Others whispered of ambition, plotting, and the potential removal of the rightful heir. The uncertainty fed a climate of anxiety. Every procession, every council announcement, and every public display of authority was scrutinized. England was a kingdom holding its breath, waiting for the next move. It was during these months that the critical events which would define Richard's legacy began to unfold. The debate over the prince's legitimacy intensified, and the wheels of legal justification were set in motion. Richard's allies pressed the argument that Edward V and his brother were illegitimate, clearing the path for Richard to assume the crown. The councils debated, the clergy pronounced, and the nation held its breath. Each moment built tension, as the question loomed: would Richard act in the best interest of the realm, or would he seize power for himself? The complexity of Richard's situation cannot be overstated. As protector, he had responsibilities to the young king, to the council, and to the kingdom. Simultaneously, he was a man of ambition, aware of the precarious nature of dynastic succession and the opportunities that the death of a king presented. Balancing these competing pressures required intellect, patience, and resolve. Richard was acutely aware that a misstep could lead to rebellion, loss of support, or even death. Yet he also understood that decisive action could secure his position and the stability of the kingdom simultaneously. The months of 1483 were a tense dance of appearances and intentions. Richard exercised authority carefully, projected loyalty, and positioned himself as the guardian of the realm. Every council meeting, every decree, and every military movement was calculated. Allies were rewarded, potential threats monitored, and the young king's movements controlled. The line between protection and usurpation was invisible, and it was precisely this ambiguity that created the enduring mystery surrounding Richard's actions. By the summer, the stage was set. Edward V remained in the Tower, awaiting his coronation that would never come. Political support coalesced around Richard, and the narrative of the prince's illegitimacy had been codified. The nation, already fragile from years of civil war, faced a critical choice. Richard could step forward to stabilize the kingdom, or he could cross the threshold from protector to king. Each observer, whether noble, clerk, or commoner, sensed the gravity of the moment, as if the very air of England were charged with anticipation. The final decision came swiftly. By June 1483, Richard moved to claim the crown, justified by the legal arguments his allies had orchestrated and the moral authority he claimed as protector. The shift was sudden, yet meticulously orchestrated, a transition that would ignite debate for centuries. England, a nation weary from conflict, now faced a new reality. The child king was set aside, and Richard, Duke of Gloucester, became Richard III, King of England. The consequences of these months were profound. Loyalty and suspicion intertwined, alliances shifted, and the young prince's fate became the central question of history. Richard's reputation was sealed in that moment, casting a shadow that would define him as either a loyal guardian or a cunning usurper. Chapter 10: The Princes in the Tower. The Tower of London had always been a place of power, of ceremony, and of fear. Its walls had witnessed coronations, imprisonments, and executions, standing as a symbol of royal authority in the heart of England. Yet in 1483, the Tower became the stage for one of history's most enduring mysteries: the disappearance of the young princes. Edward V and his brother Richard of Shrewsbury. Their fate would forever cloud the reign of Richard III, casting shadows of suspicion that no historian could fully lift. Edward V, only 12, and his younger brother Richard, just 9, were children thrust into a maelstrom of politics and ambition. After their father, Edward IV, died, they were placed in the care of their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who had been named protector of the realm. In theory, Richard's role was to safeguard them, to guide England through the turbulent period until Edward V reached maturity. Yet appearances, no matter how carefully crafted, often conceal the deepest truths. From the very first day of their residency in the Tower, whispers circulated. Courtiers, servants, and officials observed Richard's movements and the prince's confinement. Some noted the meticulous care he took to secure the Tower, ensuring that entrances were guarded and communications controlled. Others sensed an unsettling stillness, a silence that weighed heavier than protection. The boys were seen less often in public, their world reduced to the stone corridors and shadowed chambers of the fortress. The political atmosphere outside the tower was equally tense. England was divided between factions loyal to the Woodvilles, the family of the boy's mother, and those who supported Richard's claim to the throne. Nobles whispered of plots, rumors of illegitimacy, and potential threats from foreign courts. Every message, every letter, and every council meeting was imbued with suspicion. The kingdom held its breath, knowing that the next turn of events could determine the future of the monarchy. Richard, now consolidating power as king, had to navigate this perilous environment carefully. Any overt act against the princes could incite rebellion, alienate allies, or provoke foreign intervention. At the same time, the young heirs represented both a threat and a challenge. If they were recognized as legitimate, Richard's own claim could be questioned. If they were removed from the picture by exile, imprisonment, or death, the stability of his reign could still be imperiled by scandal, dissent, and resentment. In this context, the prince's disappearance becomes a story of fear, calculation, and uncertainty. Contemporary accounts suggest that the boys were last seen publicly in the tower during the summer of 1483. After that, records become scarce, fragmented, and contradictory. Some sources imply that they were confined strictly, their access to the outside world limited. Others hint at secretive movements and unseen attendance. And still, other reports, written decades later under Tudor influence, suggest darker possibilities, that the boys were murdered, eliminated to secure the throne. The mystery deepened as conflicting narratives emerged. Tudor propagandists, writing after Henry VII claimed the crown, painted Richard III as a calculating villain, the murderer of his nephews. They described secret chambers, hidden staircases, and clandestine orders executed under the cover of darkness. According to these accounts, the princes were quietly removed from the tower, their lives extinguished in a bid for absolute power. Yet scholars caution that much of this testimony was created to justify the rise of the Tudors and demonize Richard, raising questions about reliability and bias. Modern historians have examined physical evidence, chronicles, and even skeletal remains purportedly belonging to the princes. In 1674, during renovations in the tower, workers discovered two small skeletons buried beneath a staircase, thought to be Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury. The bones were reinterred in Westminster Abbey, but controversy continues to surround their identity. Were these truly the missing princes, victims of murder, or were they another pair of children, lost to time, while the true fate of Edward and Richard remains forever unknown? Whatever the truth, the disappearance of the princes had immediate political consequences. Richard's opponents used the event to question his legitimacy, painting him as a tyrant who would stop at nothing to secure his throne. Propaganda spread across England and into continental Europe, shaping perceptions for centuries. Within Richard's own court, allies may have questioned his methods, while others silently accepted the necessity of decisive action to preserve the kingdom's stability. In either case, the shadow of suspicion followed him relentlessly. The psychological impact of the prince's absence on Richard himself is a subject of debate. Some historians suggest he may have been haunted by guilt or paranoia, aware that history would judge his actions harshly. Others argue that he was pragmatic, seeing the boys as political obstacles whose removal, in the harsh calculus of medieval power, was necessary. In either scenario, the weight of the decision, whether made or merely rumored, shaped his reign and cemented his reputation as a king feared and misunderstood. London, the capital, became a focal point for tension and rumor. Citizens whispered in taverns, marketplaces, and churches, speculating about the fate of the young princes. Nobles circulated letters, each version of events more alarming than the last. Foreign ambassadors reported conflicting accounts back to their courts, influencing international diplomacy. England itself seemed poised on a knife's edge, with every citizen aware that the monarchy's stability and perhaps their own safety was precariously balanced. The disappearance of Edward V and his brother also illustrates the broader context of medieval kingship. In a time when legitimacy was paramount and bloodlines dictated power, the presence of potential heirs could destabilize even a seemingly secure throne. Richard, a brilliant strategist and astute politician, understood this intimately. Whether he acted to protect himself, to shield the kingdom from civil unrest, or both, the consequences were immediate and irreversible. The line between protector and usurper blurred into a shadow, leaving England to grapple with uncertainty and fear in the years that followed. The mystery of the princes became a symbol of the dangers inherent in monarchy, the fragility of succession, and the murky interplay of loyalty, ambition, and morality. Authors, historians, and dramatists revisited the story repeatedly, each generation interpreting Richard's actions through the lens of their own times. Shakespeare, writing decades later, immortalized Richard III as a villain, a cunning manipulator who would stop at nothing for power. Yet, even today, debate persists, fueled by gaps in the historical record, contradictory sources, and the inability to definitively prove what happened to Edward and Richard. For Richard, the disappearance of the princes served to consolidate power. The throne was now his, and the kingdom, still weary from civil war, required strong leadership. Yet the legacy of suspicion would never leave him. Every decision, every military campaign, every legal reform carried the shadow of what had happened in the Tower. Allies and enemies alike judged his actions in light of the missing princes, and every act of authority became intertwined with questions of morality, legitimacy, and ambition. As months passed, the story of the princes became enshrined in rumor, chronicled in partial records, and amplified by the fears of a kingdom uncertain of its future. England's political landscape was transformed. The House of York, though still powerful, was tainted by scandal and fear. Richard's coronation loomed as a decisive moment, one that would define his reign in history's judgment. Yet the echo of the Tower, the silence of the missing princes, and the unresolved questions continued to haunt every corner of the kingdom. The mystery of the princes in the Tower remains one of history's most chilling unsolved puzzles. Were they quietly eliminated, victims of political necessity? Were they hidden, spirited away to safety, their lives lost to secrecy? Or did they perish under circumstances that will never be known? Every theory carries weight, every possibility fuels intrigue, and every unanswered question deepens the shadow surrounding Richard III's legacy. In this darkness, England watched and waited, caught between hope and fear, loyalty and treachery, protection and usurpation. The kingdom was a stage for political theater in its most suspenseful and tragic form, and from this stage, the next chapters of Richard III's reign would unfold rebellion, war, and ultimately, the dramatic confrontation that would decide the fate of the kingdom. And the last Plantagenet king, the Tower of London, with its cold stone walls, narrow staircases, and hidden chambers, remains a symbol of this mystery. It is a reminder of ambition and vulnerability, of childhood innocence lost to power, and of the enduring question that history has yet to answer. The prince's fate continues to captivate the imagination, a story woven from fragments, speculation, and the dark allure of unsolved history. And so, as England waited, as whispers of fear and accusation filled the air, one truth became clear. The disappearance of Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury would shape the destiny of the kingdom, define the legacy of Richard III, and create a shadow over history that would never fully lift. The stage was set, the coronation approached, and the kingdom, still scarred by civil war, held its breath, knowing that the events that followed would change England forever. Chapter 11. The Coronation of Richard III. The air of London in the summer of 1483 was thick with tension, anticipation, and unease. The city, scarred by decades of civil war, had seen kings rise and fall, armies march through its streets, and courts filled with whispers of betrayal. Now, all eyes were on Richard, Duke of Gloucester, whose path from protector of the realm had led him to the precipice of power. His coronation was not merely a ceremony, it was the public and irrevocable declaration of a shift that would forever alter the course of English history. Richard's ascent to the throne was shadowed by the lingering mystery of the princes in the Tower. Rumors, both whispered and written, circulated throughout the kingdom. Were the young Edward V and his brother alive, hidden from view, or had they been quietly removed, their absence a calculated step toward consolidating Richard's claim? England's populace, the nobility, and foreign observers alike, were gripped by uncertainty. This uncertainty infused the coronation with a tension that was palpable. The ceremony itself, held in Westminster Abbey, was grand, meticulously orchestrated, and steeped in the tradition of medieval kingship. Richard appeared before the gathered lords, clergy, and citizens, clad in robes of state that gleamed in the sunlight. Every detail, from the placement of the crown to the recitation of oaths, had been designed to project authority, legitimacy, and divine approval. He knew that the eyes of the kingdom were upon him, and that perception could be as powerful as law or blood in establishing a king's power. Yet beneath the surface of ceremony, the political climate was volatile. England was a nation divided by factionalism, scars from the Wars of the Roses still raw. The Woodvilles family of the late Edward IV's queen had lost influence but remained a powerful and determined faction. Their whispers and plots threatened to undermine Richard's authority at every turn. Nobles who had once pledged loyalty to Edward IV now questioned their allegiance. The coronation was not merely a religious and civic ritual, it was a stage upon which loyalty, fear, and ambition would be tested. Richard's coronation was also a legal and moral maneuver. In the weeks preceding the event, the question of Edward V's legitimacy had been codified, with clergy and advisers asserting that the previous king's marriage had been invalid. By establishing that Edward V could not inherit the throne, Richard created the legal and moral framework to justify his ascension. For some, this was clever political reasoning. For others, it was a dangerous overreach, an act that blurred the line between protection of the realm and usurpation. The ceremony itself was striking in its solemnity and precision. The bells of Westminster rang, calling the people to witness the transfer of power. Priests performed the rites of anointment, blessing the new king as chosen by God. The crown, heavy with gold and jewels, was placed upon Richard's head with ceremonial gravity, symbolizing both divine favor and earthly authority. To the assembled crowd, the ritual was awe-inspiring. Yet for those who understood the hidden currents of politics, the air was tense with unease. Every gaze, every gesture, every word carried significance. Outside the abbey, the city watched with a mixture of curiosity, hope, and fear. Londoners, accustomed to the turbulence of war and royal intrigue, sensed the fragility of the moment. Banners of the Yorkist house fluttered in the breeze, while street vendors whispered stories of the missing princes, tales of intrigue, and predictions of rebellion. The coronation was as much a spectacle for the public as it was a declaration of power for the elite. Richard understood the importance of perception, and he used it to consolidate support, projecting an image of authority that even skeptics could not easily challenge. The reactions of the nobility were mixed. Some embraced the new king, pledging loyalty in a display of political prudence and self-preservation. Others remained cautious, measuring Richard's words and actions, seeking signs of weakness or opportunity. The tension among the lords reflected a broader struggle for survival, influence, and power. England, still scarred by decades of civil strife, was a land where loyalty was transactional, and ambition often concealed itself behind masks of allegiance. Richard's coronation also carried profound symbolic weight. By placing the crown upon his head, He was not merely assuming kingship, he was asserting the authority of the House of York, of his own lineage, and of a vision of England that he believed necessary for stability. The ceremony conveyed that Richard, despite whispers and rumors, was now the embodiment of royal authority. Yet the shadows of uncertainty lingered. The fate of Edward V and his brother haunted the minds of many, raising questions about morality, legitimacy, and the nature of power. Even as the ceremony concluded, whispers persisted. Foreign ambassadors documented the event with keen interest, noting the nuances of Richard's demeanor, the reactions of the lords, and the atmosphere among the populace. These observers recognized that the coronation was not merely a formal procedure, it was a test of the kingdom's loyalty, a declaration of intent, and, potentially, a prelude to further intrigue. England had witnessed kings rise and fall, but the circumstances surrounding Richard III's ascent were unprecedented in their combination of legality, ambition, and moral ambiguity. Richard's personal demeanor during the coronation was one of controlled solemnity. Every gesture, every glance, every word was measured. He was aware of the precariousness of his position. Though crowned king, his authority remained contingent upon the acceptance of both the nobility and the populace. Any misstep could incite rebellion, undermine support, or provide fodder for rivals. The weight of the crown was not merely physical. It was symbolic of the immense responsibility, danger, and scrutiny that accompanied kingship in a nation still reeling from civil war. The months following the coronation were critical. Richard moved to consolidate his authority, issuing proclamations, confirming appointments, and securing key fortresses. He demonstrated his understanding of both governance and military strategy, showing decisiveness and resolve. Yet every act of authority was shadowed by the unresolved mystery of the princes. While the kingdom accepted him as king in form, doubt lingered in substance. Historians, chroniclers, and contemporaries all questioned, to what extent had Richard orchestrated events to remove potential rivals? To what extent was he truly acting in the interest of the realm? The coronation also marked the beginning of Richard's relationship with the people. He sought to present himself as a just, capable ruler, aware of his duties and the challenges of leadership. Yet he was ever conscious of the whispers of fear and suspicion that followed him. England, a nation still bruised by war, demanded stability, but it also remained vigilant, scrutinizing the character and intentions of its new monarch. Richard's every action, from policy to personal conduct, would be interpreted through the lens of the missing princes. The shadow of illegitimacy and the legacy of civil conflict, as the new king settled into his reign. England watched, waited, and speculated. The coronation was both an ending and a beginning, an ending to the period of uncertainty following Edward IV's death, and the beginning of a reign defined by both accomplishment and controversy. Richard III, crowned in the heart of Westminster Abbey, had achieved the pinnacle of power, yet the shadows of suspicion, rumor, and fear were inseparable companions, shaping the narrative of his rule and the perceptions of history itself. The mystery of the princes, the contested legitimacy of the crown, and the calculated precision of Richard's ascent combined to create a story that would echo for centuries. Shakespeare would later immortalize Richard III as a villain in dramatic literature, and Tudor historians would craft narratives that painted him in the darkest colors. Yet beneath the layers of myth and propaganda, the events of the coronation reveal a man of intelligence, calculation, and acute political awareness, someone who understood the dangers of a fractured kingdom and the tenuous nature of power. In the months and years that followed, Richard III would face rebellion, political maneuvering, and the threat of Henry Tudor. His reign, initiated by this coronation, would be marked by decisive action, legal reform, and attempts to stabilize a kingdom still recovering from the Wars of the Roses. But the coronation itself remained the defining moment. the public declaration that the protector of the realm had become king, that the ambiguity of succession had been resolved at least officially, and that England's fate had been irrevocably altered. And yet the shadows lingered. Every corridor of the Tower, every whisper in the streets of London, every rumor circulating in the courts of Europe reminded all that the coronation, while grand, had not erased suspicion. The missing princes, the contested legitimacy, and the calculated moves that led to this day ensured that Richard III's reign would always be scrutinized, questioned, and debated. England had crowned a king, but it had also birthed a mystery whose echoes would endure for centuries. The stage was set for the events that would follow. Rebellion in the north, the rising threat of Henry Tudor, and the decisive battles that would ultimately determine the fate of Richard III and the House of York. The coronation was not merely a ceremony, it was the overture to a dramatic, turbulent, and tragic chapter of English history, one in which ambition, loyalty, fear, and power collided with irrevocable consequences. Chapter 12. Rebellion in the Shadows. Richard III's coronation was complete, yet the kingdom he had inherited was far from secure. England, still healing from decades of civil war, was a patchwork of loyalty and distrust. Every county, every town, every noble house carried memories of betrayal, loss, and shifting alliances. The air was thick with uncertainty, and in the shadows, whispers of rebellion began to stir. These were not merely idle rumors, they were the first signs of a challenge that would test the very foundation of Richard's reign. The northern regions of England, long distant from the center of power in London, had their own allegiances, traditions, and grievances. Here nobles wielded influence, their armies loyal to family ties and local interests rather than to any monarch seated far to the south. These men had watched the rise and fall of kings, the collapse of dynasties, and the devastation of towns and villages. They understood that power in London could be fragile, and they knew that an ambitious king, even one crowned by law and ceremony, could be resisted if the opportunity arose. Among these northern nobles, Lord Francis Lovell and the Stanley family observed Richard III with cautious interest. Lovell, a close ally of Richard and a man of military skill and ambition, recognized both the potential and the dangers inherent in the new king's position. The Stanleys, however, were more circumspect. Their loyalties divided between Yorkist tradition and the distant promise of Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian claimant in exile. England, it seemed, was a kingdom in which allegiance was negotiable and rebellion always a possibility. The first stirrings of dissent were subtle. Messages carried by messengers, intercepted letters, and whispered conversations in candlelit halls hinted at plotting and intrigue. Some nobles complained openly about Richard's consolidation of power, arguing that the exclusion of the princes from the public eye was morally and politically troubling. Others spoke privately of seizing opportunity, waiting for the moment when the king might overreach, making himself vulnerable. Richard, a man of intelligence and vigilance, sensed these currents immediately. He knew that a ruler's strength was often measured not only by victories on the battlefield, but by the ability to anticipate, contain, and neutralize threats before they became open rebellion. In the early months following his coronation, Richard took decisive action to secure loyalty. He confirmed appointments of loyal officials, rewarded supporters, and maintained strict oversight of key fortresses, particularly in the north. Yet even as he consolidated power, resistance grew quietly. Small uprisings, carefully orchestrated challenges to authority, and rumors of conspiracies created a climate of tension and unease for a king seeking to project authority. Every shadow and whispered word was a potential threat. The rebellion in the shadows was not simply political, it was personal. The lingering fear and anger over the fate of Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury fueled distrust. Families who had been loyal to Edward IV's line questioned the morality of Richard's actions. Clergy debated the legitimacy of the throne. Foreign powers, particularly France and Brittany, monitored the kingdom closely, ready to exploit weakness. In this environment, rebellion was not only possible, but inevitable. The question was not if, but when, and in what form it would strike. Richard's response to these early signs of rebellion demonstrated both strategic acumen and psychological insight. He understood the importance of perception, public displays of justice, visits to key towns, and the careful management of council meetings projected stability and authority. At the same time, he monitored potential dissenters, gathering intelligence and assessing the loyalty of nobles. Every action was calculated to prevent open revolt, yet allow for decisive action if necessary. England, in many ways, was a chessboard, and Richard moved his pieces with careful precision. One of the most significant challenges came from the Duke of Buckingham, a once loyal ally whose ambitions and influence in the West and Midlands could sway large numbers of men. Buckingham's relationship with Richard was complex. He had been instrumental in securing Richard's path to the throne, yet his loyalty was conditional, based on recognition, reward, and opportunity. In the shadows, whispers of dissent began to circulate. Could Buckingham, powerful and influential, become a rival? Or would he remain a steadfast supporter of the king? The answer, unknown to Richard at the time, would soon test the strength of alliances, revealing the fragility of trust in a kingdom still scarred by civil war. The Northern Rebellion also involved ordinary people, whose lives had been shaped by war, famine, and political instability. Townspeople and peasants, often caught between rival factions, were sometimes complicit in acts of defiance, either through passive resistance or active participation. Markets, churches, and gatherings became venues for rumor and plotting. Richard understood that rebellion was not only the work of nobles with armies, but could emerge from the collective discontent of the populace. He acted accordingly, combining diplomacy, displays of force, and careful communication to maintain authority, while avoiding unnecessary provocation. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, Henry Tudor and his supporters watched closely. In exile, Henry cultivated alliances, promising rewards and legitimacy to those willing to oppose Richard III. The possibility of foreign support in rebellion added another layer of danger. England, already divided internally, now faced the potential of invasion or civil conflict fueled by exiled claimants. Richard's position, though legally secure, was strategically precarious. Every rebellion in the shadows, every whispered plot, could be amplified by foreign support, making containment more difficult and the stakes even higher in this period of tension. Richard demonstrated his capacity for both strategic patience and decisive action. He strengthened fortresses, positioned loyal troops, and carefully monitored communications. At the same time, he used public ceremonies, legal proclamations, and acts of governance to project authority and legitimacy. By controlling both perception and reality, Richard sought to suppress rebellion before it could erupt, understanding that the appearance of weakness could encourage insurgency. The shadow of rebellion also tested Richard's personal relationships. Allies like Lovell remained steadfast, providing military and political support, while others, such as Buckingham, displayed signs of ambition and discontent. Courtiers, always calculating their own advantage, observed closely, seeking opportunities to gain favor or exploit perceived vulnerabilities. Richard's ability to navigate these relationships required acute judgment, patience, and the willingness to act decisively when necessary. Any misstep could be fatal not just to his reign, but to his life. As months passed, signs of open rebellion began to crystallize. Disaffected nobles, sensing both vulnerability and opportunity, began to prepare forces. Communications were intercepted, alliances shifted, and plots became more tangible. Richard, ever vigilant, understood that the first overt act of rebellion would test both his authority and the loyalty of his supporters. The kingdom, already fragile from years of civil war, teetered on the edge of renewed conflict. The question of morality loomed over these events. Richard's actions, whether to suppress rebellion, negotiate with dissenters, or take preemptive measures, were shadowed by ethical ambiguity. To some, his maneuvers were necessary for the stability of the realm. To others, they were ruthless attempts to consolidate personal power. In medieval England, where law, loyalty, and survival intersected in complex ways, morality was rarely straightforward. The decisions made in these months would have consequences that extended far beyond Richard's immediate reign. One of the defining aspects of this rebellion in the shadows was its secrecy. Unlike battles fought openly on fields or in sieges, these conflicts unfolded in council chambers, private correspondence, and whispered meetings. Intelligence, espionage, and surveillance became as crucial as armies and fortresses. Richard's ability to anticipate and neutralize threats before they erupted into open conflict demonstrated both political skill and strategic foresight. Yet the very secrecy of these operations amplified the sense of paranoia, as allies and enemies alike wondered what moves were hidden in the shadows. By the autumn of 1483, the situation had escalated. Rumors of plots, potential uprisings, and foreign intervention created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion. Richard's actions, while methodical, were interpreted through the lens of the missing princes, the contested legitimacy of his claim, and the memory of civil conflict. The kingdom was a powder keg, and the spark could come from any quarter. A disaffected noble, a foreign ally of Henry Tudor, or even a misinterpreted action by the king himself. Despite these dangers, Richard displayed remarkable political acumen. He strengthened his position through careful appointments, managed public perception with ceremonies and proclamations, and maintained a network of loyal supporters. Yet even as he acted decisively, the rebellion in the shadows never fully dissipated. England, divided by loyalty, fear, and ambition, remained a kingdom in which power was fragile and authority contested. The months of 1483 reveal a monarch both calculating and vigilant. Richard III understood that the survival of his reign depended on navigating a labyrinth of loyalties, threats, and perceptions. Chapter 13. The Threat of Henry Tudor. Across the English Channel. In the relative safety of exile, Henry Tudor watched the unfolding drama in England with calculated patience. A distant claimant to the throne, his lineage tied to the Lancastrian cause, Henry was a man whose ambitions had been tempered by years of waiting, danger, and observation. While Richard III consolidated power in London and suppressed rebellion at home, Henry quietly built alliances, nurtured hopes of foreign support, and waited for the moment when England's instability would create opportunity. The very existence of Henry Tudor presented a psychological and political challenge to Richard III. Though separated by miles of water and territory, Henry's presence lingered as a shadow over the kingdom. Nobles, courtiers, and commoners alike understood that, while Richard's coronation solidified his claim and form, Henry's bloodline and his ties to the Lancastrians offered a competing narrative of legitimacy. Every rumor, every whisper, from Brittany or France, reminded England that the throne was contested, and that danger might arrive, not from within, but from abroad. Henry's preparation was methodical. He cultivated supporters among exiled Lancastrian loyalists and disaffected English nobles who were unsettled by Richard's rise. These men, often motivated by a mixture of ambition, loyalty, and fear, became conduits of information, plotting, and potential military action. Henry's advisors emphasized caution, understanding that any premature attempt to assert his claim could result in disaster. Yet, patience carried its own power. The longer Richard ruled amidst domestic unrest and the unresolved mystery of the princes, the more fertile the ground became for Henry's eventual intervention. In England, Richard III remained acutely aware of the potential threat. The king, whose intelligence and political acumen were formidable, monitored rumors of Henry's activities and scrutinized the loyalty of his nobles. He understood that Henry's strength did not lie solely in his ability to raise armies, but in his capacity to exploit divisions within England. Every disaffected noble, every uncertain town, and every lingering question about the legitimacy of Richard's reign was an avenue for Henry's influence to seep into the kingdom. The political landscape was complicated. Not all opposition to Richard III was overt. Much of it existed in subtle shifts of allegiance, private correspondence, and clandestine plotting. Foreign courts played a critical role, offering support, sanctuary, or encouragement to factions willing to challenge Richard. Henry Tudor's presence abroad gave hope to these factions, suggesting that a coordinated effort could succeed. The king's advisors warned of the dangers, yet even they could not fully predict the exact moment when rebellion might crystallize into action. Richard responded with the same blend of caution and decisiveness that had characterized his early reign. He reinforced the loyalty of his allies, particularly in regions where discontent simmered beneath the surface. Military leaders were placed in strategic locations, and fortifications were inspected to ensure readiness in case of invasion or uprising. Richard also employed diplomacy, sending messages to key nobles and foreign rulers alike, projecting authority and attempting to discourage any alignment with Henry Tudor. The balance was delicate. Act too harshly, and one risks inciting revolt. Act too weakly, and the enemy sees opportunity. The shadow of the princes in the Tower intensified the threat. Richard's critics, both domestic and abroad, pointed to the disappearance of Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury as evidence of moral compromise and political ruthlessness. For Henry Tudor, this shadow provided both justification and propaganda. He could present himself as a rightful heir, seeking justice and stability, contrasting his position with Richard's alleged crimes. The narrative was potent. A king who might have murdered his nephews versus a claimant positioned as a savior of the realm. Public perception, always a powerful force in medieval politics, became a weapon in Henry's hands, even before he set foot on English soil. Intelligence networks played a critical role in this period. Richard employed spies, informants, and trusted nobles to track potential supporters of Henry. Letters were intercepted, messages scrutinized, and allegiances monitored. This web of observation was crucial, for rebellion often begins quietly, nurtured in secret before exploding into open conflict. Richard understood that foresight could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. Yet even the most meticulous surveillance could not guarantee absolute security. Human ambition and the allure of power were unpredictable forces, capable of undermining the best-laid plans. Henry Tudor's advisors urged patience and planning. Brittany and France, wary of direct conflict with England, yet eager to influence its succession, offered sanctuary and material support. Henry cultivated loyalty through promises, political negotiation, and the careful management of his public image. He was portrayed not merely as a claimant to the throne, but as a figure of hope for those dissatisfied with Richard's rule. Every correspondence and every overture of support reinforced his potential as a rallying point for rebellion within England. Back in England, Richard faced the daunting task of preparing for both internal unrest and foreign-supported invasion. Nobles with divided loyalties posed a constant risk, while regional instability could be exploited by Henry's supporters. Richard's response combined military readiness, strategic appointments, and political maneuvering. He sought to maintain a semblance of stability while projecting strength, understanding that perception and reality must align to prevent opportunistic rebellion. The threat of Henry Tudor also brought into focus the fragility of alliances. Figures like Buckingham, whose loyalty had previously been crucial, now faced temptation from the promise of reward or favor should Henry succeed. Richard had to gauge their commitment carefully, balancing incentives with oversight and subtle intimidation. The game of loyalty was intricate, and any miscalculation could lead to open revolt. England, after decades of civil war, remained a realm in which trust was conditional and ambition relentless. Every month that passed, the tension grew. Rumors of Henry's preparations circulated, often exaggerated by fear and speculation. Nobles whispered of potential landing points, military strategy, and secret correspondence. The populace, already uneasy due to the unresolved fate of the princes and the recent upheavals, became increasingly susceptible to rumor and intrigue. Richard's authority, though legally secure, remained fragile in the court of public opinion and the realm of human ambition. Richard's legal and moral justification for his kingship was constantly under scrutiny. The argument regarding Edward V's illegitimacy was used to legitimize his ascent, yet critics questioned whether legality could compensate for perceived immorality. Henry Tudor's narrative leveraged this doubt, portraying Richard as a tyrant whose actions were driven by personal ambition rather than duty to the realm. The power of story, propaganda, and moral framing became as critical as armies, fortresses, and political alliances. The months leading to potential conflict were characterized by careful observation, minor skirmishes of influence, and subtle demonstrations of power. Richard strengthened loyalist positions, monitored enemy movements, and sought to preempt plots before they became crises. Henry Tudor, meanwhile, cultivated hope, coordinated with disaffected nobles, and waited for the right moment when England's internal divisions and Richard's vulnerabilities could be exploited. The stage was being set for confrontation, not merely of armies, but of ideas, legitimacy, and historical narrative. The psychological weight of the threat cannot be overstated. For Richard, every decision carried consequences that could determine life, death, and the future of the kingdom. Every noble's allegiance, every town's loyalty, every whisper of rumor was a variable in a complex equation of power. England, though officially at peace under Richard III's crown, simmered with tension. A kingdom poised between obedience and rebellion. Henry Tudor's eventual intervention would not be spontaneous. It was the culmination of careful planning, observation, and exploitation of England's fractured political landscape. Yet even the most meticulous planning relied on chance, human error, and timing. Richard III, aware of these realities, sought to neutralize threats before they fully matured, using intelligence, loyalty, and strategic positioning to maintain control. Yet the shadows of rebellion and foreign intervention loomed large, a constant reminder that kingship in this era was as much about perception and timing as it was about law and ceremony. As England approached the pivotal confrontation, the tension reached its zenith. Henry Tudor's threat was not distant speculation. It was an immediate, tangible risk that had the potential to destabilize the entire kingdom. Richard's every act, from appointments to military positioning, was framed by the knowledge that this claimant, nurtured in exile, could arrive at any moment with the force of ambition, legitimacy, and opportunity. The months of preparation, observation, and subtle conflict set the stage for one of the most dramatic periods in English history. Richard III's reign, though initially stabilized through coronation and political maneuvering, now faced its ultimate test, the emergence of Henry Tudor as a rival, backed by exiles, disaffected nobles, and foreign powers. Chapter 14. Richard's Rule, Fear, Law, and Reform. Richard III, now firmly seated upon the throne, faced a kingdom still raw from decades of civil war. England was fragile, fractured by rival factions, lingering loyalties, and the scars of battles that had torn families, towns, and fields apart. To stabilize his reign, Richard needed more than coronation ceremonies and strategic alliances. He required a framework of governance that would command obedience, quell rebellion, and project the authority of the crown across every corner of the realm. At the heart of his strategy was a combination of law and fear, a dual approach that both reassured and intimidated. Richard understood that a ruler's power was as much about perception as it was about force. To maintain control, he needed the nobility to respect the crown's authority, the populace to feel secure yet watchful, and potential adversaries to recognize the consequences of defiance. It was a delicate balance, one that required intelligence, decisiveness, and ruthlessness in equal measure. One of Richard's first acts was to reform the legal system, a move that surprised many contemporaries. While kings were often associated with arbitrary justice, Richard emphasized consistency, efficiency, and the enforcement of law. He issued proclamations that clarified procedures, sought to prevent abuses by powerful nobles, and reinforced the crown's authority as the ultimate arbiter of justice. These reforms, while practical, carried a deeper political purpose. They signaled to the kingdom that Richard was a ruler capable of both wisdom and authority, and that rebellion or insubordination would not be tolerated. Fear, however, was never far from Richard's strategy. He understood that human nature, ambition, and resentment could inspire resistance, even in those who owed him allegiance. The lessons of the Wars of the Roses had been brutal: nobles who overreached, alliances that shifted, and opportunities for rebellion had cost kings their crowns and lives. Richard's measures were calculated to deter such ambitions. Public executions, careful displays of authority, and the swift punishment of dissent sent clear messages to the kingdom. Loyalty was required, and betrayal would be met with decisive action. The missing princes in the Tower cast a long shadow over Richard's reign. While he had secured the throne legally, suspicions about their fate persisted, fueling discontent and rumor. The populace, already wary from years of civil war, whispered about the morality of the king's ascent. Nobles, who might have been loyal, weighed the risks of opposition against the fear of Richard's wrath. Every act of governance, every legal reform, every military maneuver was interpreted in light of this underlying suspicion. Richard had to navigate this moral ambiguity, balancing his desire for stability with the need to maintain legitimacy. In the eyes of both the kingdom and history, Richard's reforms were practical and far-reaching. He sought to standardize procedures in the courts, strengthen local governance, and ensure that taxation and legal enforcement were more predictable. This not only improved the efficiency of government, but also enhanced the perception of a king who cared about justice and order. For the common people, who had endured years of uncertainty and war, these reforms brought a sense of stability. For nobles, they underscored the crown's authority and reminded them that loyalty came with tangible expectations and consequences. Yet, even as Richard strengthened his administration, the threat of rebellion remained. Henry Tudor's name lingered across the Channel, a distant but growing danger. Disaffected nobles, some motivated by personal ambition, others by loyalty to the Lancastrian cause, watched Richard's actions closely. They waited, calculating the moment when rebellion might yield rewards. The king's challenge was not merely to govern, but to anticipate, prevent, and neutralize threats before they erupted into open conflict. Every move had to be measured, every decision precise, and every relationship carefully managed. Fear and reform were intertwined. Richard's legal changes enhanced the crown's power, but the enforcement of these laws reminded the kingdom of the consequences of disobedience. Public punishments, carefully administered, reinforced the message that the king's authority was absolute and that defiance would be met with swift retribution. Yet he tempered fear with fairness, ensuring that laws were applied consistently enough to maintain credibility and avoid alienating key supporters. In doing so, Richard projected both strength and legitimacy, a combination essential to survival In a politically volatile environment, the north of England remained a region of particular concern. Its nobles, historically semi-autonomous and fiercely loyal to their own interests, required careful management. Richard's appointments, military presence, and strategic marriages were designed to secure their allegiance while preventing the emergence of independent power bases. The delicate task of balancing authority and autonomy defined much of his domestic policy, illustrating both his political skill and the constant tension between loyalty and control. Richard also understood the importance of symbolism in consolidating power. Ceremonial displays, public proclamations, and the careful presentation of the crown reinforced his image as a legitimate, divinely sanctioned ruler. These actions, while outwardly celebratory, served a strategic function. They projected an aura of inevitability, suggesting to nobles and commoners alike that resistance was futile, and that the king's authority was both established and enduring. Despite these efforts, challenges persisted. The Duke of Buckingham, whose support had once been critical, began to chafe under Richard's assertive rule. Other nobles, sensing opportunity or emboldened by lingering suspicions about the princes, tested the boundaries of loyalty. The threat of Henry Tudor remained, a constant reminder that Richard's power, while formidable, was never unchallenged. In this environment, vigilance became a daily necessity. Every decision carried weight, every action could provoke consequence, and every whisper in the court or streets might presage rebellion. Richard's administration also extended to economic and military concerns. He ensured that fortifications were maintained, that troops were loyal and strategically placed, and that resources were managed efficiently. These measures were both practical and symbolic. They demonstrated that the king could protect the realm, and that power was concentrated in the hands of a capable, watchful ruler. Economic stability, legal clarity, and military preparedness were intertwined components of Richard's strategy to maintain authority in a kingdom still wary from civil strife. The king's personal reputation became a tool in governance. Tales of decisiveness, courage, and legal fairness circulated, reinforcing his image. Yet stories of ruthlessness and suspicion, whether true or exaggerated, enhanced the perception that rebellion carried risk. In the intricate interplay of fear, loyalty, and perception, Richard navigated a landscape where authority was both exercised and observed, where power depended not only on law and force, but also on the careful management of narrative and image. Throughout Richard's reign, the shadow of Henry Tudor loomed. England's factions, discontented nobles, and the memory of civil war created fertile ground for rebellion. Richard's reforms, while stabilizing, could not eliminate risk entirely. Instead, they acted as tools to manage uncertainty, projecting strength while preparing for the inevitable challenges that history seemed poised to deliver. The careful combination of fear, law, and reform allowed Richard to consolidate power, but it also created a tense, watchful atmosphere, where every action was scrutinized and every potential rival considered a threat as the months passed. Richard's authority was both reinforced and tested. Small uprisings were suppressed, disloyal nobles reminded of consequences, and governance became more efficient. Yet the unresolved fate of the princes, the ambitions of Henry Tudor, and the unpredictable dynamics of loyalty ensured that tension remained high. England's stability was maintained, but it was fragile, dependent on careful management, perception, and the constant vigilance of the king. Richard III's rule during this period illustrates the complexity of kingship in medieval England. Authority was not absolute. It was negotiated, enforced, and constantly challenged. Legitimacy required both legal foundation and moral perception. Power required both strategic patience and decisive action, and survival demanded a combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and foresight. Richard's ability to balance these elements defined the strength of his reign and the precariousness of his position. The shadow of rebellion and the looming threat of Henry Tudor ensured that Richard's rule was never secure. Every noble's allegiance, every town's loyalty, and every rumor carried weight. England, though outwardly stable, simmered with uncertainty. Richard's mastery of law, fear, and governance allowed him to maintain control, but it also highlighted the constant pressures and dangers faced by a monarch whose legitimacy was contested and whose enemies were vigilant. The story of Richard III's rule is not merely one of consolidation, but of tension, strategy, and the interplay between power and perception. Fear and law were tools, but they were never sufficient alone. Authority had to be reinforced constantly, loyalty nurtured, and threats anticipated. Chapter 15. Ghosts of the Princes. Guilt and rumors. Even as Richard III consolidated his rule through law, fear, and reform, a shadow lingered that no crown, army, or legal decree could banish the shadow of the missing princes. Edward V and his younger brother Richard of Shrewsbury, confined in the Tower of London, were gone from public view. Their absence was a secret known to few, a mystery whispered in corridors and council chambers, a story debated in hushed tones across the kingdom. For Richard, this shadow was both a political challenge and a haunting presence, shaping the perception of his reign in ways that words, decrees, and ceremonies could never fully control. The mystery of the princes was a narrative that refused to be contained. Londoners speculated, nobles whispered, and foreign courts observed. The very ambiguity of their fate became a tool wielded by opponents, a lever by which they questioned the morality and legitimacy of the king. Was Richard III a protector of the realm acting in the kingdom's best interest, or a usurper who had removed his nephews to claim the crown? The question was impossible to answer definitively, and the uncertainty fueled both fear and fascination. The psychological impact on Richard himself cannot be underestimated. He was a king acutely aware of both perception and reality. In private, he would have known the stakes of every decision, the consequences of every act, and the way in which rumor could shape history. Yet in public, he needed to project calm authority, confidence, and control. The tension between the private weight of suspicion and the public performance of kingship created a complex, often perilous balancing act. Whispers of guilt began to permeate not only the streets, but also the court. Courtiers speculated about the prince's fate, and even loyal allies wondered how far Richard's ambition might have extended. Some believed he had orchestrated their removal to secure the crown. Others believed in the more charitable explanation, that their disappearance was a protective measure, a precaution in a kingdom still unstable after decades of war. Regardless of the truth, the story shaped Richard's rule. Rumor became a force as powerful as law, a reminder that perception could rival reality in the governance of men. This atmosphere of uncertainty fueled rebellion in subtle ways. Nobles, cautious or ambitious, measured the king's resolve, looking for signs of weakness or hesitation. Towns and markets, always susceptible to rumor, became arenas where the story of the missing princes circulated and evolved. The power of narrative, amplified by fear and uncertainty, threatened to undermine Richard's authority even as he enforced laws and strengthened his administration. Foreign powers, too, observed closely. France, Brittany, and other European courts documented the events in London with keen interest. They understood that the legitimacy of the crown, the stability of England, and the personal reputation of Richard III were intertwined. Any perception of moral compromise or illegitimacy could be exploited, turning internal uncertainty into external opportunity. In this way, the ghosts of the princes were not merely symbolic. They were active players in the politics of the kingdom, shaping strategy, alliances, and intrigue. Richard's response to these rumors was strategic. He continued to enforce the law, project authority, and consolidate loyalty. but he also engaged in careful narrative management, ceremonial displays, public pronouncements, and the selective use of allies all served to counteract the rumors, presenting the image of a king both legitimate and resolute. Yet even the most effective narrative could not entirely erase doubt. The uncertainty surrounding the princes became an inseparable element of Richard's reign, influencing both allies and adversaries. The human element of fear and suspicion was equally significant. Nobles who had once been loyal began to hedge their bets, evaluating the risks of rebellion against the consequences of loyalty. Courtiers, always calculating their position, observed closely, interpreting every gesture and statement as a signal. Richard's every action, while measured, carried psychological weight. He had to navigate not only the practicalities of governance, but also the intangible influence of rumor, perception, and fear. This period of Richard's reign also illuminates the role of moral narrative in history. The missing princes, whether alive, dead, or hidden, became symbols that transcended immediate political concerns. They embodied questions of justice, legitimacy, and the ethical responsibilities of power. For historians, chroniclers, and playwrights in later centuries, the story of Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury would define Richard III as much as his military and political actions. In the present, however, these ghosts were immediate, practical, and profoundly destabilizing. Richard's ability to maintain authority amid this uncertainty was remarkable. He balanced law and fear with diplomacy and intelligence. He reinforced loyalty through strategic appointments, ensured military readiness, and carefully monitored potential dissent. Yet the shadow of the princes was never fully controllable. It influenced decisions, colored perceptions, and added a layer of psychological pressure that no legal reform or display of power could entirely remove. The fear surrounding the missing princes was not abstract. It manifested in concrete ways. Minor rebellions, hesitant allegiances, and the cautious behavior of nobles reflected a kingdom where uncertainty bred action. Richard had to anticipate potential threats arising from rumor alone, understanding that perception could motivate rebellion as effectively as any tangible grievance. The stakes were existential. Misjudging loyalty, underestimating suspicion, or mismanaging narrative could imperil the throne, the crown, and his life. The psychological tension extended beyond the court. Common people, who had endured the devastation of war and the uncertainties of succession, carried their own interpretations of events. Stories of vanished children, usurped authority, and mysterious acts by the king circulated in markets, inns, and homes. These rumors, while often exaggerated or distorted, reinforced the perception of a king whose morality and actions were contested, shaping the environment in which Richard governed. Despite the weight of rumor and suspicion, Richard demonstrated resilience and political skill. He maintained a stable government, suppressed minor insurrections, and projected an image of competent authority. His legal reforms and administrative efficiency helped solidify his rule. Yet the ghosts of the princes remained an ever-present challenge, reminding all that power is rarely absolute, and legitimacy is often contested. The relationship between fear, rumor, and governance in this period highlights the complexity of kingship in medieval England. Authority was not merely enforced through law or military might. It was negotiated through perception, narrative, and moral legitimacy. Richard III's reign provides a vivid example of how the unseen forces of rumor, guilt, and suspicion could shape political strategy and decision-making, influencing both the king and the kingdom he sought to control. The persistence of these ghosts also amplified Richard's sense of urgency. The threat of rebellion, the scrutiny of foreign courts, and the potential intervention of Henry Tudor all demanded vigilance. Each day carried the risk that the unresolved mystery of the princes would inspire action, embolden conspirators, or invite foreign interference. The psychological and political pressures intertwined, creating a tense environment in which every choice had profound consequences. In this atmosphere, Richard's personal quality, decisiveness, and strategic foresight were critical. He managed both perception and reality, balancing displays of authority with careful governance, and projecting legitimacy even as doubts persisted. Yet the ghosts of the princes served as a constant reminder that even the most skilled ruler must contend with forces beyond control, the power of rumor, the sway of public opinion, and the enduring influence of moral narrative. As Richard III navigated these pressures, England remained a kingdom suspended between order and instability. The missing princes were more than symbols, they were active agents in the political, psychological, and moral landscape of the reign. Their absence shaped decisions, inspired caution, and influenced the behavior of allies and adversaries alike. The tension between what was visible and what was unknown, between legality and morality, defined the very character of Richard's kingship. Ultimately, the story of the missing princes underscores the fragility of power in a kingdom scarred by civil war. Even a king crowned with ceremony and legitimized by law could not escape the consequences of uncertainty. The ghosts of Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury haunted Richard's reign, influencing strategy, shaping perception, and reminding all that authority in medieval England was never absolute. As the months and years passed, the pressure of these shadows intensified. Rebellion, foreign threat, and the psychological weight of suspicion created an environment in which every action required calculation, every decision carried risk, and every moment could alter the trajectory of history. Richard's ability to navigate these challenges defined his reign. Yet the unresolved fate of the princes remained a persistent, haunting question. The chapter of Richard III's reign, defined by the ghosts of the princes, is a story of tension, strategy, and the interplay between power, perception, and morality. Authority was maintained not merely through law or force, but through the management of rumor, fear, and narrative. Chapter 16. The Betrayal of Buckingham, by 1483. Richard III's reign had solidified in some ways, yet the kingdom remained a powder keg of suspicion, ambition, and tension. Despite his efforts to stabilize the throne through law, fear, and reform, the cracks in loyalty began to widen, threatening to destabilize his rule. The most dramatic manifestation of this tension would come from an unlikely quarter. Henry Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham, once Richard's closest ally, confidant, and co-conspirator in securing the crown. His betrayal would mark a turning point in the reign of the last Plantagenet king, illustrating the precarious nature of power and the volatile dynamics of loyalty in medieval England. Buckingham had been instrumental in Richard's ascension, a powerful noble with extensive influence in the West and Midlands. His military support and political guidance had helped navigate the turbulent transition following Edward IV's death. Without Buckingham's support, Richard's path to the throne might have been obstructed or, at the very least, delayed. Their alliance, forged in ambition and mutual advantage, seemed unbreakable. Yet beneath the surface, cracks had begun to form, cracks driven by ambition, resentment, and opportunity. The initial seeds of Buckingham's discontent were subtle. While Richard had strengthened his administration through appointments, fortifications, and legal reforms, Buckingham's expectations were not fully met. Promises of reward, recognition, and autonomy had been partially fulfilled, but he desired more. He envisioned himself as a kingmaker, a ruler in waiting, perhaps even a monarch in his own right if the opportunity presented itself. The balance between loyalty and ambition, always delicate, began to tilt precariously. Whispers of discontent grew in the corridors of power. Buckingham, a man of intelligence and strategy, began to gauge support among other disaffected nobles and courtiers. He explored alliances with those dissatisfied with Richard's rule and cultivated relationships with Lancastrian loyalists, all the while maintaining the outward appearance of fidelity. In the shadowed world of medieval politics, Such duplicity was common, yet the consequences were deadly. Richard, despite his vigilance, could not anticipate the full extent of his ally's ambitions until the betrayal was imminent. The political context of the rebellion was critical. England remained divided, its memory scarred by decades of civil war. Regional loyalties were strong, and the northern and western nobility often acted independently of the crown. Meanwhile, the shadow of Henry Tudor, a distant but growing threat, provided a rallying point for opposition. Buckingham's ambitions aligned with the interests of those who opposed Richard, creating the conditions for a coordinated challenge to the throne. The betrayal was not spontaneous. It was the result of careful observation, calculation, and timing. In the summer of 1483, Buckingham began to take decisive steps. He reached out to Henry Tudor, promising support for his claim to the throne and pledging his resources in exchange for future reward. The plot extended beyond mere correspondence. It included plans to mobilize forces, coordinate uprisings in key regions, and challenge Richard's authority. This level of planning underscored the seriousness of the betrayal and revealed the vulnerability inherent even in a well-established monarchy. Richard's response to early signs of dissent demonstrates both his political acumen and the limits of his foresight. He continued to project strength publicly, reinforcing his authority through ceremonies, legal proclamations, and the consolidation of loyal forces. Yet Buckingham's duplicity, carefully concealed beneath layers of allegiance and outward loyalty, remained largely invisible until the plot reached its critical stage. The king's intelligence network, while extensive, could not fully penetrate the subtle web of ambition woven by a close ally. The timing of Buckingham's betrayal was calculated to maximize impact. By coordinating uprisings in multiple regions simultaneously, he sought to stretch Richard's resources, destabilize loyalist forces, and create confusion within the administration. The plan relied on both secrecy and speed, exploiting the gaps in communication and the divided loyalties that characterized England at the time. Buckingham's strategy was bold, audacious, and deeply dangerous, a reflection of both his ambition and his understanding of the fragility of Richard's reign. The social dimension of the betrayal cannot be underestimated. Buckingham's influence extended to towns, villages, and the gentry, many of whom were swayed by his reputation and authority. His charisma, coupled with dissatisfaction over perceived grievances, allowed him to cultivate support quickly. This social mobilization, while not sufficient to threaten Richard's core power directly, created a climate of instability and heightened tension throughout the realm. For a king already navigating rumors, fear, and the unresolved mystery of the princess, the betrayal represented an existential challenge. The psychological impact on Richard III was profound. The realization that a trusted ally could turn against him struck at the heart of his understanding of loyalty, strategy, and human ambition. In medieval politics, alliances were often fragile. Yet the treachery of someone so integral to his rise to power carried particular significance. It was a reminder that authority depended not only on law, fear, and reform, but also on the unpredictable nature of human desire and ambition. Richard's reign, though carefully constructed, was always vulnerable to betrayal from within. The consequences of Buckingham's betrayal were immediate. In regions under his influence, local uprisings began to emerge. Troops were mobilized, fortifications challenged, and communications intercepted. Richard, aware of the threat, moved decisively. He reinforced loyalist positions, summoned trusted allies, and prepared to confront the rebellion with both military and strategic measures. Yet the challenge was complex. It required not only force, but also psychological insight, diplomacy, and rapid decision-making under pressure. Richard's military response demonstrates his strategic skill. He leveraged loyal forces, anticipated potential points of rebellion, and acted quickly to suppress uprisings before they could gain momentum. Yet even with decisive action, the political fallout was unavoidable. Buckingham's treachery had exposed vulnerabilities within the realm, tested loyalties, and reminded all that ambition often outweighed allegiance. The king's authority was reinforced through action, but the psychological and political impact of betrayal lingered, influencing perception and behavior in ways that would resonate throughout the remainder of his reign. The interplay of fear, loyalty, and ambition is particularly evident in the case of Buckingham. His betrayal underscores the inherent instability of medieval kingship, where power was negotiated, trust was conditional, and ambition often overrode duty. For Richard, it was a lesson in the limits of control, the necessity of vigilance, and the unpredictable nature of human behavior. Even the most loyal allies, if not carefully managed and understood, could become existential threats. The wider context of the rebellion also illuminates the interconnectedness of domestic and foreign threats. Buckingham's coordination with Henry Tudor and exiled Lancastrian loyalists exemplifies how internal discontent could be amplified by external forces. England, already politically fragmented, was vulnerable to the convergence of internal betrayal and foreign-supported claims. Richard's position, though legally secure and administratively reinforced, remained perilous, dependent on both strategy and perception. Despite the immediate threat, Richard acted with calculated decisiveness. He mobilized forces strategically, prioritized key regions, and engaged in targeted suppression of rebellion. His intelligence network worked to identify potential sympathizers, monitor movements, and anticipate further threats. This combination of preparation, decisiveness, and strategic foresight illustrates Richard's capacity to manage complex political crises. Even in the face of personal betrayal, Buckingham's fate was ultimately sealed by the very network of loyalty and authority he sought to undermine. Captured during the rebellion, he faced execution, a dramatic and public demonstration of Richard's authority. The punishment served as both retribution and warning, signaling to all that betrayal, particularly from within the inner circle, would not be tolerated. The spectacle reinforced the connection between loyalty, fear, and consequence, central elements of Richard's strategy to maintain power in a volatile kingdom. The rebellion, though suppressed, left lasting consequences. It exposed the fragility of alliances, demonstrated the persistent threat posed by ambitious nobles, and reinforced the necessity of strategic vigilance. Richard's authority, while intact, had been tested, and the episode underscored the precarious nature of kingship in an era where ambition often superseded duty, and loyalty could be as fleeting as opportunity. Buckingham's betrayal also influenced the broader trajectory of Richard's reign. It heightened the king's awareness of both internal and external threats, sharpened his strategic focus, and underscored the importance of controlling narrative, loyalty, and perception. For the kingdom, it was a moment of tension, uncertainty, and fear, illustrating the complex interplay of ambition, power, and consequence that defined the political landscape of the late 15th century. Chapter 17. England on the Brink. By late 1483, England stood on the edge of crisis. The kingdom, still bearing the scars of decades of civil war, teetered between stability and chaos. Richard III, though crowned and legally secure, faced a realm fractured by fear, ambition, and lingering suspicion. The betrayal of Buckingham had exposed vulnerabilities in the loyalty of the nobility, and the shadow of Henry Tudor's claim loomed across the Channel. Every day, England's fragile peace threatened to collapse, a tinderbox waiting for a single spark. The political landscape was perilous. Nobles, once allies, now viewed the throne with caution and calculation. Their loyalty was no longer guaranteed. Ambition, personal grievances, and the lure of opportunity made their allegiances fluid. In towns and counties across the kingdom, Whispers of rebellion circulated, fueled by rumors of the missing princes and dissatisfaction with Richard's rule. The king's attempts at legal reform and displays of authority had stabilized governance in some areas. Yet the underlying tensions remained, simmering just beneath the surface. Richard III understood the stakes. The consolidation of power required vigilance, decisiveness, and strategic foresight. He reinforced loyalist positions, appointed trusted allies to key posts, and strengthened fortifications in regions most susceptible to dissent. Military readiness became a priority, as the possibility of both internal revolt and foreign-supported invasion loomed large. The king's intelligence network worked tirelessly, intercepting correspondence, monitoring noble activity, and attempting to anticipate potential threats before they could materialize. Yet, even with meticulous preparation, uncertainty persisted. England's political fabric was fragile, stretched thin by decades of civil war and divided loyalties. The North, historically semi-autonomous and fiercely independent, required careful management. The South and West, with their own power bases and influential nobles, presented additional challenges. Every decision carried consequences. Every act of governance had to balance authority with diplomacy, strength with perception. The kingdom was a chessboard, and Richard's moves had to be precise, calculated, and responsive to forces both visible and hidden. The psychological pressure on the king was immense. The betrayal of Buckingham had revealed the potential for treachery from within the inner circle, and the unresolved fate of the princes continued to haunt the court. Richard's advisors warned of discontent, rebellion, and the possibility of Henry Tudor's intervention. Every rumor, every whisper, every report of dissatisfaction became a factor in decision-making. The weight of kingship, already heavy, was intensified by the knowledge that one miscalculation could ignite widespread unrest. Henry Tudor, though still in exile, emerged as a growing threat. His supporters, a mixture of Lancastrian loyalists and disaffected English nobles, coordinated plans to challenge Richard's rule. Henry's presence in Brittany provided a safe haven for plotting, as well as the potential for foreign support in the form of troops, resources, and political legitimacy. The king's intelligence network was aware of these movements. Yet the timing and scope of Henry's potential intervention remained uncertain. This uncertainty, combined with domestic instability, created a tense atmosphere in which every decision could tip the kingdom toward rebellion or suppression. Richard's strategy for managing the crisis involved both projection of authority and careful control of perception. Public ceremonies, legal proclamations, and the enforcement of loyalty reinforced his image as a legitimate and decisive ruler. At the same time, military readiness and intelligence operations addressed tangible threats, ensuring that the king could respond swiftly to any uprising. The balance between perception and reality was critical. Nobles and commoners alike needed to believe in the crown's authority. Even as the underlying tensions persisted, the kingdom's social and economic conditions also contributed to instability. Years of war had disrupted trade, drained resources, and created widespread uncertainty among the populace. Discontent could be exploited by ambitious nobles or foreign claimants, turning minor grievances into full-scale rebellion. Richard's governance sought to address these issues through legal reform, administrative efficiency, and the careful management of taxation and resources. Yet even well-implemented policies could not eliminate the undercurrent of fear, suspicion, and ambition that defined the political landscape. Regional loyalties presented additional challenges. The North, traditionally supportive of Richard's family, remained loyal in general, but harbored factions with independent ambitions. The South and West, influenced by nobles like Buckingham and other ambitious leaders, contained pockets of resistance and potential rebellion. Richard had to monitor these regions closely, balancing the need for military readiness with diplomacy and careful oversight. The coordination of loyalty and suppression was delicate, requiring constant attention to both human behavior and political dynamics. Communication, or the lack thereof, played a critical role. Messages between nobles, towns, and the court were slow and often unreliable, leaving gaps that could be exploited by ambitious factions. Richard's intelligence network attempted to bridge these gaps, but misinformation, rumor, and deliberate deception complicated the picture. Every intercepted message, every reported whisper, had to be interpreted carefully, as misjudgment could lead to missed opportunities or unexpected rebellion. The complexity of governance in this period cannot be overstated. It was a high-stakes environment where perception, timing, and decision-making intertwined. The moral dimension of the crisis further heightened tension. The missing princes, whose fate remained unresolved, continued to cast a shadow over the kingdom. Nobles, foreign powers, and commoners interpreted the king's legitimacy through the lens of this mystery. Richard's efforts to project authority and maintain loyalty were constantly counterbalanced by questions of morality and justice. The ethical ambiguity surrounding his ascent and the fate of Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury created an environment in which rumor, suspicion, and fear were powerful political tools in the hands of both supporters and adversaries. Richard's responses were multifaceted. Military fortifications were reinforced, loyal troops strategically deployed, and key allies appointed to oversee regions most vulnerable to unrest. Legal reforms continued, emphasizing order, justice, and the crown's authority. At the same time, the king maintained a visible presence in ceremonies, proclamations, and public affairs, projecting confidence and decisiveness. These measures, while effective to some degree, could not fully mitigate the unpredictability of human ambition, or the potential for unsupported rebellion. As tensions escalated, signs of impending conflict became more apparent. Disaffected nobles moved covertly, towns and regions expressed dissatisfaction, and reports of foreign support for Henry Tudor's claim reached the court. The convergence of these factors created a climate in which any spark could ignite widespread rebellion. England was, in every sense, on the brink, politically, socially, and psychologically. The stability achieved through law, fear, and reform was fragile, dependent on vigilance, strategy, and the careful management of both allies and adversaries. The coming months would test Richard III's leadership in unprecedented ways. The kingdom's divisions, the unresolved mystery of the princes, and the threat of Henry Tudor's intervention created a scenario in which failure could mean not just political defeat, but personal ruin. Richard's decisions in this critical period would determine not only the survival of his reign, but also the future trajectory of the English monarchy. The pressure was immense, the risks extraordinary, and the consequences potentially catastrophic. Every decision mattered. Every move, from the deployment of troops to the management of alliances, carried the weight of potential disaster. Richard's ability to navigate these challenges required intelligence, foresight, and the capacity to anticipate human behavior. The kingdom's fragile stability depended on the delicate interplay of authority, loyalty, fear, and perception. One misstep, one miscalculation, could unravel everything the king had worked to achieve, as England teetered on the edge. The narrative of Richard III's reign became increasingly defined by suspense, uncertainty, and the interplay of power and perception. The betrayal of Buckingham, the shadow of the missing princes, and the looming presence of Henry Tudor created a complex, high-stakes environment in which every actor from king to noble to commoner was part of a tense, unfolding drama. The kingdom itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable clash that would determine the fate of the crown. Richard's challenges were not merely military or political, they were psychological. The constant awareness of potential rebellion, the need to project authority, and the ever-present shadow of Henry Tudor created a pressure cooker environment. The king's capacity to maintain focus, make decisive choices, and enforce loyalty was tested daily. Every whisper, every rumor, and every perceived slight could influence the course of events, and Richard had to navigate these pressures with skill, determination, and caution. In the north, the south, and the Midlands, the tension was palpable. Nobles weighed their options, townsfolk discussed rumors, and soldiers prepared for action. Chapter 18. The Road to Bosworth Field. The summer of 1485 arrived with an uneasy calm across England. Richard III, a king forged in the crucible of civil war, had spent his reign consolidating power, suppressing rebellion, and projecting authority. Yet even the most meticulously maintained throne could not withstand the confluence of ambition, fear, and destiny. Across the Channel, in the relative safety of Brittany, Henry Tudor prepared to make his claim to the English crown. For Richard, the threat was both distant and immediate. The looming invasion would test his leadership, the loyalty of his nobles, and the very strength of the kingdom he had fought to govern. The journey to Bosworth Field was not a single moment, but a series of calculated decisions, movements of troops, and manipulations of alliances. Richard understood the stakes. Every town along the route, every noble allegiance, and every logistical preparation could tip the scales in favor of victory or doom. The road was both literal and symbolic, a path toward confrontation with Henry Tudor, and the ultimate test of Richard's kingship. In the months preceding the battle, intelligence played a crucial role. Reports of Henry Tudor's landing in Wales arrived with growing urgency. Tudor's force was relatively small, but symbolically powerful, a figure with a legitimate claim, a banner around which discontented nobles could rally, and the promise of foreign support from France and Brittany. Richard's advisors debated strategy, weighing the risks of early engagement against the dangers of allowing Tudor to gain strength. Each decision carried weight, as hesitation or miscalculation could lead to catastrophe. Richard's movements toward confrontation were marked by both strategic calculation and psychological warfare. He sought to project strength, inspire loyalty, and intimidate potential defectors. His army, composed of seasoned soldiers and loyal nobles, was positioned to both defend the crown and assert dominance over territories vulnerable to rebellion. Every march, every camp, every display of military readiness communicated a message. The king was vigilant, prepared, and unyielding. The role of alliances was central to the unfolding drama. Richard relied on the loyalty of Northern and Midlands nobles, many of whom had long-standing ties to the House of York. Yet the betrayal of Buckingham had left lingering doubts, and the possibility of defection remained a constant concern. To secure loyalty, Richard employed a combination of promises, intimidation, and rewards, carefully managing both allies and potential rivals. The human element of the battlefield, ambition, fear, and loyalty, was as critical as the strategic placement of troops or the quality of weapons. Meanwhile, Henry Tudor's advance brought with it a sense of inevitability. The narrative of a rightful claimant returning to reclaim the throne resonated across disaffected regions. Nobles dissatisfied with Richard's rule, combined with those loyal to the Lancastrian cause, began to align their interests with Tudor. The psychology of rebellion, the power of narrative, and the perception of legitimacy became intertwined, transforming the approaching invasion from a mere military challenge into a complex struggle for hearts, minds, and loyalty. Richard's preparation reflected his understanding of both terrain and logistics. The march toward the South and the Midlands was carefully calculated, ensuring supplies, communication lines, and defensive positions were maintained. His knowledge of England's geography, combined with intelligence about Tudor's movements, allowed for strategic positioning designed to confront the invading force on favorable terms. Yet even the best-laid plans were subject to the unpredictable forces of weather, morale, and human decision-making. The political dimension of the road to Bosworth Field was equally significant. Richard's courtiers debated tactics, nobles weighed allegiance, and the common people observed with a mixture of fear and fascination. Rumors, letters, and secret meetings shaped expectations, influenced decisions, and created an atmosphere of uncertainty. The march toward battle was not merely military. It was an intricate interplay of strategy, psychology, and politics, in which perception could influence outcome as much as swords and spears. As the armies moved closer to confrontation, Richard's confidence and command were tested. The Northern and Midlands forces, though loyal, were stretched across territory, and the potential for desertion or hesitation loomed. Henry Tudor's relatively small force, while numerically inferior, carried the symbolic power of legitimacy and the promise of rewards to those willing to defect. Every interaction, every observation, and every maneuver could inspire loyalty or prompt betrayal, making the road to Bosworth a perilous journey in more ways than one. Richard's leadership during this period exemplified both skill and resolve. He maintained discipline, reinforced strategic objectives, and motivated his army through a combination of rhetoric, example, and demonstration of authority. The psychological preparation of his troops was as critical as their physical readiness. Morale, confidence, and perception of the king's invincibility could tip the outcome of battle even before swords were drawn. Richard's ability to project strength, command respect, and anticipate human behavior was central to his strategy. The role of Henry Tudor's supporters added further complexity. Key noble figures, including those previously loyal to Richard, were courted by Tudor, offering the promise of reward, status, and influence in a future regime. The potential for defection created uncertainty within Richard's ranks. Trust, already fragile due to past betrayals, like Buckingham's, was tested. Decisions about deployment, engagement, and negotiation required both strategic foresight and a deep understanding of human psychology. As the armies approached the fields near Market Bosworth, tension reached its peak. The geography of the battlefield, including hedgerows, roads, and villages, became critical factors. Richard, a commander seasoned by decades of warfare, analyzed the terrain, planned formations, and positioned troops for maximum effectiveness. Every detail mattered: the placement of archers, the alignment of cavalry, the positioning of reserves. The battle would be decided not only by courage and skill, but by preparation, insight, and the ability to anticipate the actions of friend and foe alike. The march to Bosworth also highlighted the interplay of chance and human decision-making. Whether morale and timing could alter the outcome in unforeseen ways, reports of loyalty, desertion, and discontent reached Richard's ears constantly, requiring rapid judgment and adaptability. The road to battle was a test not only of military skill, but of psychological acuity and political awareness. Every decision carried potential consequences far beyond the immediate moment. Richard's personal resolve and strategic vision were central to the unfolding drama. He moved with purpose, understanding that hesitation or miscalculation could be fatal. The stakes were existential: the throne, the crown, and his life hung in the balance. The convergence of forces, his loyalists, disaffected nobles, and the invading Tudor army created a scenario in which every action, every maneuver, and every choice would determine the fate of England. The anticipation of battle created a charged atmosphere across the kingdom. Villages, towns, and markets observed troop movements. Rumors spread like wildfire, and morale fluctuated with each report from the front. The tension was palpable. The entire realm seemed to hold its breath, aware that the outcome of the coming conflict would reshape the monarchy, define loyalty, and determine the future trajectory of England. The approach to Bosworth Field was more than a military campaign. It was a culmination of political, psychological, and historical forces. Richard III, A king forged in ambition, strategy, and survival, faced the ultimate test of his reign. The convergence of internal dissent, external threat, and personal resolve would determine not only his fate, but the destiny of the English crown. As the two armies drew closer, the road to Bosworth became a symbol of the precariousness of power, the fragility of loyalty, and the tension between destiny and choice. Richard's leadership, judgment, and strategic acumen would be tested in ways that would define both his legacy and the course of English history. The final confrontation loomed, a collision of ambition, loyalty, and destiny that would echo through the centuries. The tension, anticipation, and uncertainty defined every step of this journey. England, poised on the edge of history, awaited the clash that would decide its future. The road to Bosworth Field was not merely a path between two armies, it was a journey into the heart of kingship, ambition, and mortality. Every decision, every movement, and every choice carried the weight of fate. Richard III's destiny, and that of the kingdom he sought to command, would be decided on that field. Chapter 19. The Last Stand of Richard III. The morning of August 22, 1485, dawned over the rolling fields near Market Bosworth with a deceptive calm. Mist clung to the hedgerows, birds circled in the pale light, and the distant hills seemed serene. Yet beneath this quiet lay a tension that gripped every man, horse, and banner across the two converging armies. Richard III, a king forged in the crucible of civil war, rode among his troops, acutely aware that today would define not just his reign, but the course of English history. The battlefield stretched before him, a stage where ambition, loyalty, and destiny would collide. Richard's army, loyal yet strained, numbered roughly 12,000 men, a mixture of seasoned veterans from northern strongholds and newly raised levies from the Midlands. Every banner fluttered in the early light, a symbol of allegiance, pride, and purpose. Yet beneath the disciplined formations, uncertainty lingered, whispers of defection, hesitation among key nobles, and the memory of Buckingham's betrayal weighed heavily on the king's mind. Leadership in this moment required more than strategy. It demanded the projection of absolute confidence, the ability to inspire courage, and the clarity to anticipate both friend and foe. Across the field, Henry Tudor's forces, smaller in number, moved with a quiet intensity. Approximately 5,000 men, including Breton mercenaries and a handful of exiled Lancastrian supporters, formed a disciplined yet symbolically potent army. Tudor's banner, displaying the red rose of Lancaster, represented more than a political claim. It was a beacon for disaffected nobles and a challenge to the legitimacy of Richard's rule. The psychological power of this symbol resonated across the landscape, a silent provocation that threatened to unravel loyalty. Within the Yorkist ranks, Richard's strategy for engagement reflected his experience and audacity. He positioned his troops to take advantage of the terrain, using hedgerows, rolling fields, and natural choke points to maximize defensive and offensive potential. Archers were placed on elevated ground, cavalry held in reserve for decisive maneuvers, and infantry arranged in disciplined formations to withstand charges. Every placement, every alignment, and every command carried the weight of foresight and anticipation. Yet even the most meticulous planning could not eliminate the unpredictable variables of human behavior and battlefield chaos. The psychological dimension of the confrontation was immense. Richard, acutely aware of the fragility of loyalty, understood that courage and morale could determine the outcome as much as swords or spears. He rode among his men, speaking, gesturing, and demonstrating authority. His presence was a tangible reminder that the king, though mortal, was also a commander unyielding in resolve. The act of leadership, in this moment, was as much about inspiring belief as issuing orders. The battle began with the clamor of trumpets, the roar of men, and the movement of cavalry. Yorkist forces advanced with precision, engaging Tudor's lines, probing for weakness, and seeking to exploit any hesitation. Archers released volleys into the misty morning, while infantry clashed with a deafening cacophony of steel on steel. The chaos of engagement enveloped the field, transforming strategy into instinct, and calculation into reaction. Every soldier, every horse, every maneuver contributed to a complex tapestry of violence, courage, and survival. Despite initial Yorkist advances, the tide began to shift. Tudor's forces, disciplined and motivated by both purpose and desperation, withstood the initial assault. Crucially, key Yorkist nobles, swayed by the promise of Tudor's victory or uncertain of their own loyalty, began to hesitate, withdraw, or defect. The psychological impact of defection in the midst of battle cannot be overstated. Confidence among the Yorkists faltered, leaving gaps and vulnerabilities that Tudor's commanders exploited with precision. The battlefield became a test not only of skill, but of resolve, loyalty, and perception. Richard III, witnessing the faltering of his lines, made a decision that would define his final moments. Leading a decisive charge, he sought to strike at the heart of Tudor's forces, aiming to destabilize the enemy and rally his own men. Mounted on his horse, armored and resolute, the king became a focal point of courage and determination. Yet even the boldest acts of leadership could not overcome the erosion of morale and the shifting allegiances that characterized this battle. The clash reached its zenith near Ambion Hill, a strategic point on the battlefield. Richard's cavalry cut through enemy lines, creating temporary disorder among Tudor's troops. His personal bravery inspired nearby soldiers. Yet the broader Yorkist army was beginning to crumble under the weight of hesitation, defection, and fatigue. The interplay between individual heroism and collective cohesion became starkly apparent. Courage alone could not substitute for loyalty, strategy, and disciplined coordination. Witness accounts and later chronicles paint a vivid picture of Richard's final stand. Surrounded, outnumbered in critical positions, and facing the collapse of his army, he fought with determination, rallying troops and attempting to regain the initiative. Every blow he struck, every command he issued, was a manifestation of both skill and desperation. The king's resolve was unyielding, yet the forces arrayed against him, coupled with the fracturing of loyalty within his ranks, created an insurmountable challenge. The moment of confrontation with Henry Tudor himself, though chaotic, became symbolic. Richard's charge toward the enemy lines represented both tactical initiative and personal valor. Accounts suggest a near-fatal encounter, where the king sought to cut through the center of Tudor's forces. Yet amidst the fray, the lack of coordinated support from hesitant nobles and defecting allies left him exposed. The interplay of chance, loyalty, and tactical execution determined the outcome, highlighting the precarious nature of kingship and battlefield command. The death of Richard III, though instantaneous in historical narrative, was the culmination of years of tension, betrayal, and political fragility. His body, found among the fallen, bore marks of close combat, reflecting the intensity and desperation of the final moments. The symbolism of his death, a king struck down in the midst of battle, loyalty fragmented, and ambition thwarted, resonated across England and would echo through history. It was both a personal tragedy and a historical pivot, marking the end of the Plantagenet dynasty and the ascent of the Tudors. The aftermath of Bosworth Field reshaped the political landscape. Henry Tudor, crowned Henry VII, solidified his claim to the throne, integrating loyal Yorkist factions and securing alliances to stabilize the kingdom. The death of Richard III eliminated the primary source of Yorkist legitimacy, creating a new era of monarchy characterized by centralization, cautious governance, and reconciliation. Yet the memory of Richard's leadership, courage, and strategic acumen persisted, influencing the perception of kingship and authority for generations. The broader consequences of the battle extended beyond the immediate political shift. England, scarred by decades of civil war, faced the challenge of integrating divided loyalties, addressing regional tensions, and rebuilding both infrastructure and trust. The transition from Plantagenet to Tudor rule required careful navigation of alliances, management of potential rebellions, and strategic consolidation of power. The human and political dimensions of this transformation were profound, reflecting the interplay between individual actions, collective behavior, and historical contingency. Richard III's final stand also underscores the psychological dimensions of kingship and warfare. Leadership is not merely about strategy and resources. It is about perception, morale, and the ability to inspire action in others. Richard's courage inspired loyalty and valor among his men. Yet even extraordinary personal qualities could not overcome structural vulnerabilities, shifting allegiances, and the unpredictable outcomes of complex human behavior. The battlefield, in this sense, becomes a microcosm of governance, a test of strategy, perception, and the delicate balance of authority and loyalty. The death of Richard III transformed not only the political order but also the narrative of English history. Chroniclers, playwrights, and historians would later interpret his reign, the mystery of the princes, and the events of Bosworth Field through the lens of morality, legitimacy, and the consequences of ambition. Yet, in the immediate aftermath, the focus was pragmatic, consolidating the Tudor claim, stabilizing the realm, and preventing further conflict. The transition, though marked by victory for one faction, was inseparable from the tension, uncertainty, and fragility that had defined Richard's kingship. The road to Bosworth and the climactic battle illustrate the intersection of preparation, loyalty, ambition, and chance. Richard III's strategic acumen, personal courage, and leadership qualities were extraordinary, yet the convergence of defection, narrative power, and tactical unpredictability rendered the outcome inevitable. The battle becomes a study in the limits of authority, the fragility of loyalty, and the decisive impact of human behavior under conditions of extreme stress. In the end, Richard's final stand embodies both heroism and tragedy. He confronted overwhelming odds with determination, sought to inspire and rally his men, and fought to preserve his crown and legacy. Yet the combination of betrayal, tactical disadvantage, and the symbolic force of Henry Tudor's claim ensured that his efforts would not succeed. Chapter 20. Legacy of a Villain. Truth or Tudor Propaganda. Richard III died on August 22, 1485, at the Battle of Bosworth Field, his body struck down in the chaos of combat. Yet his death was only the beginning of a narrative far more complex. Shadowed by intrigue, rumor, and the politics of memory, history, as it would unfold, was written largely by his victors, Henry VII and the Tudors. In the centuries that followed, Richard's reign was cast through a lens of suspicion, villainy, and dark morality, a lens that may or may not have reflected the truth. To understand Richard III, one must navigate the blurred line between fact, perception, and deliberate propaganda. The Tudor dynasty had a vested interest in portraying Richard as a usurper and murderer. The disappearance of the princes in the Tower Edward V and his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, provided a perfect narrative to justify Henry VII's claim and consolidate loyalty among the nobility and commoners. Richard's image as a villain served a political purpose. It delegitimized his rule, validated the new monarchy, and deterred future Yorkist resistance. The carefully constructed story emphasized betrayal, cruelty, and moral corruption, elements designed to secure Tudor power in a fragile post-war kingdom. Yet separating fact from fiction is a challenge. Contemporary records of Richard III's reign present a mixture of loyalty, reform, and ruthless action. Chronicles such as those by Dominic Mancini, Thomas More, and later Shakespeare shaped public perception but were influenced by politics, personal bias, or artistic license. Richard's administration, for instance, implemented legal reforms, promoted fairness in local governance, and sought to curb corruption among officials. These actions reflect a ruler concerned with order, justice, and the functionality of the kingdom. A side of Richard rarely emphasized in the stories of Villany. The mystery of the princes remains central to Richard's contested legacy. Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury vanished from public view shortly after Richard III assumed the throne. While Tudor propaganda portrayed Richard as a calculating murderer, historical evidence is inconclusive. Some suggest he may have ordered their deaths. Others propose alternative explanations, from political imprisonment to survival in secret. The truth may never be known, yet the power of the narrative shaped perceptions for centuries, casting a shadow over Richard's accomplishments and personal character. Richard's physical appearance also contributed to his portrayal. Chroniclers described him as hunchbacked, a deformity often exaggerated in Tudor accounts to emphasize moral corruption. Modern archaeology, including the discovery of his remains in 2012, confirmed he had scoliosis, a curvature of the spine, but not the exaggerated deformity depicted in Tudor narratives. This discovery highlighted how physical characteristics were manipulated to fit a story of villainy, turning human difference into symbolic evidence of moral failing. Beyond propaganda, Richard III's political actions reveal a complex ruler navigating an unstable and violent era. He dealt with rebellion, noble ambition, and regional power struggles while attempting to maintain legal order and assert royal authority. His handling of Buckingham's betrayal, suppression of uprisings, and attempts at reform demonstrate strategic acumen, decisiveness, and a capacity to respond to unpredictable circumstances. These actions, however, were overshadowed by the narrative constructed by Henry VII and perpetuated by Tudor loyalists. The role of Shakespeare in solidifying Richard's image as a villain cannot be underestimated. His play, written over a century later, dramatized the events of Richard's reign, emphasizing ambition, cruelty, and moral corruption. While the work is a masterpiece of literature, it blends fact and fiction, shaping cultural memory more than historical reality. Audiences have long accepted Shakespeare's portrayal as historical truth, reinforcing the image of Richard as a malevolent, scheming king, rather than a capable, if controversial, ruler navigating extraordinary challenges. Modern historians have sought to re-evaluate Richard III, separating myth from evidence. Archaeology, legal records, and contemporary accounts reveal a ruler engaged in governance, law, and strategy. His reputation as a tyrant is increasingly viewed as a product of Tudor political necessity, rather than a fully accurate reflection of his character. The contrast between perception and reality underscores the difficulty of understanding history when power, propaganda, and personal ambition intersect. The social and cultural context of Richard III's reign also influenced his legacy. England was emerging from decades of civil war, a landscape defined by shifting loyalties, regional divisions, and competing claims to the throne. Any ruler faced immense challenges. Decisions made to secure authority often required ruthless action. Richard's consolidation of power, though controversial, reflected the exigencies of the pragmatic approach to survival in a kingdom still scarred by conflict. Richard's legacy is further complicated by the evolving nature of monarchy. The transition from Plantagenet to Tudor rule marked a turning point in centralization, legal reform, and the management of noble loyalty. In this context, Richard's efforts to stabilize governance, enforce justice, and maintain control can be seen as both necessary and effective. His failure, culminating at Bosworth Field, was as much a result of structural vulnerability, shifting alliances, and fate as it was of personal failings. The discovery of Richard III's remains, and subsequent scientific analysis, has reignited interest in his life and reign. Forensic evidence revealed battle injuries consistent with historical accounts, confirming his death in combat rather than assassination or treachery. Examination of his skeletal remains, including signs of scoliosis, provided insight into his physical condition and challenged exaggerated portrayals of deformity. These discoveries have humanized Richard, emphasizing the man behind the myth, and offering a more nuanced understanding of his character and abilities. Richard's complex legacy also raises questions about historical memory. Villainy, heroism, and morality are often defined by narrative rather than fact, shaped by those in power and by the stories they tell. Richard III's reign illustrates how history can be weaponized, how perception can overshadow reality, and how individuals can be remembered more for the political narratives constructed after their death than for their actions in life. Public fascination with Richard III endures. Museums, documentaries, academic studies, and popular media continue to explore the tension between myth and reality. The king's life embodies the allure of history as a suspenseful, morally complex drama, blending ambition, betrayal, and the unresolved mysteries that captivate our imagination. The questions surrounding the princes, his physical appearance, and the events of Bosworth Field continue to provoke debate and inquiry, keeping Richard III alive in cultural memory. The legacy of Richard III, like that of many historical figures, is inseparable from context. He ruled during a period of instability, rebellion, and political intrigue. His decisions, both praised and criticized, reflected the demands of kingship in a volatile era, while Tudor propaganda painted him as a villain. Modern scholarship encourages a re-evaluation, highlighting both his strategic skill and the extraordinary challenges he faced. The truth, as always, lies somewhere between legend and historical record. The narrative of Richard III also serves as a cautionary tale about power, perception, and human ambition. Loyalty can be fragile, authority can be contested, and history is often written by those who survive. Richard's life and death illustrate the tension between individual capability and external forces, between perception and reality, and between ambition and destiny. His story reminds us that history is not merely a record of events, but a complex interplay of narrative, power, and memory. The enduring mystery of the princes, the circumstances of Richard's rise and fall, and the subsequent reinterpretation of his reign provide fertile ground for exploration, debate, and storytelling. Each element, the alleged villainy, the acts of governance, the battlefield heroism, and the physical reality adds depth to a portrait of a king whose life and death continue to inspire fascination. Richard III remains a figure at the intersection of myth and history, embodying the suspense, drama, and moral complexity that define the human story. Richard's legacy challenges us to consider how history is constructed, how perception shapes memory, and how the past continues to influence the present. His reign, though brief, illustrates the fragile balance between ambition, loyalty, and consequence. Bosworth Field, the fate of the princes, and the Tudor propaganda that followed remind us that truth is often contested. Narrative is powerful, and history is always a story shaped by perspective. In the end, Richard III is neither entirely villain nor unblemished hero. He is a complex figure navigating extraordinary circumstances, whose life and death were shaped by ambition, loyalty, betrayal, and the inexorable forces of history. His story endures because it is a narrative of suspense, power, and human drama story that continues to captivate, challenge, and inspire curiosity. The final chapter of Richard III's life and legacy, like the reign itself, is a study in contrasts, heroism and villainy, myth and reality, ambition and consequence. Thank you for joining us on Dark History, where the past reveals its shadows and secrets. Today, we explored the rise, reign, and ultimate fall of Richard III, story of ambition, betrayal, and the fragile nature of power. If you found yourself captivated by the mysteries of history, don't forget to subscribe to Dark History and hit the bell icon so you never miss a journey into the forgotten corners of the past. Remember, history isn't just what's written in books, it's what lurks in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the darkness of history.